The wind blows strongly on the coast of the Mediterranean, dragging the echo of the voices of merchants, warriors, and peasants. The world seemed divided between those who looked at the sea with hope and those who feared what could arise from their waters. In the heart of this melting pot, the Greek cities rose like scattered, small but overflowing headlights, while in the East Plains, a roar began to grow, a roar that was named after Cyrus. Ciro the Great was not a common man. His ambition was like a fire that could not go out. Every step it took seemed marked by an unwavering destination. The average and fighting lands had already fallen under their shadow, and Babylon, with their colossal walls and hanging gardens, leaned before him as a brittle branch in the middle of the storm. Its army, composed of elite archers, fast and disciplined soldiers, advanced as an unstoppable tide, sweeping everything in its path. But it wasn't just the force that defined it, it was his cunning. He did not conquer just with swords. He promised protection, let the gods of the defeated remain in their temples, and spoke with soft words that hid iron control. Each city that fell under his command became one more piece of his empire, a mosaic of cultures intertwined under his vigilant gaze. However, while the Persians expanded their domains to the west, the Greeks, on the other side of the sea, clung to their freedom as a child to their most precious toy. The Greek polis were not vast empires. They were small worlds locked between stone walls, where the echo of the debates in the agoras was mixed with the sound of the hammers in the workshops. Athens shone with his nascent democracy, a bold experiment that gave voice to the people and challenged the norms of power. Sparta, on the other hand, rose as an iron strength, where each child learned from a young age that life and death were simply tools to serve the state. While Cyrus moved his pieces on the board, the Greeks argued, fought, and dreamed. In their temples, the gods listened to the supplications of peasants who asked for abundant crops and generals who begged victories on the battlefield. But there was something else in the air, a warning murmur, a feeling that the waves that brought wealth and news could also drag enemies and destruction. In Sardes, capital of the kingdom of Lydia, the fires of the torches illuminated the walls while the Persians approached. King Craso, known for his immense wealth, had underestimated the eastern conqueror. His defeat was not only a military fall, but an omen for the Greeks. If such a powerful city could be crushed, what hope did they have? However, fear did not paralyze them. On the contrary, he made them more third. They built ships, reinforced their defenses, and began to look beyond their internal disputes. Because although separated by walls and differences, there was something that united them, the love for freedom. It was not an abstract freedom, but something tangible, something that could be touched in the markets, celebrated at the festivities, and protect itself with shields and spears. Meanwhile, Cyrus continued to progress. His gaze perched on the Greek colonies of Asia Minor, small but strategic. I knew they were not just cities, they were doors to the heart of Greece. But Ciro would not see the end of this story. His death in battle left his son, Cambyses too, the task of continuing with the dream of an empire without limits. And so, the Mediterranean world was on the verge of a storm. On the one hand, an empire that grew as an endless shadow, swallowing entire kingdoms and cultures. On the other, a set of city-states that lived in constant fighting, but that kept inside a spark that refused to go out. What none of them knew is that this spark was about to become fire. A fire that would burn in battlefields, in blood-stained, and in the hearts of those who refused to bow their heads. While the days passed and the rumors of invasions grew, the Persians continued to prepare their progress, and the Greeks began to lift their eyes towards the horizon. Because on that horizon not only the sea was seen. The beginning of something that would change the story was seen forever. The sun burned over the desert sands while the troops of Cambyses II advanced, their elongated shadows projecting as omens of what was to come. Persian banners waved in the wind, and the echo of their drums resonated as an incessant beat. There was no rest for the heir of Cyrus the Great. His father had left him a vast empire, but Cambyses was not satisfied. His eyes were put in Egypt, the jewel of the Nile, a real kingdom in gold, grain, and legends. The Piamatic III pharaoh prepared to defend his land, but was not ready for the storm that was coming. The Persian arrows darkened the sky when the forces of Cambyses crossed the Sinai desert. The Egyptians fought with courage, but the Battle of Pelusium ended in a disaster. According to the chroniclers, Cambyses used cats and other sacred animals as living shields, exploiting the religious devotion of the Egyptians. It was a tactic as ruthless as it is effective. Psammetico was captured, and Egypt fell to your knees. The victory of Cambyses made him pharaoh, but his reign was full of shadows. The stories about their cruelty spread as smoke: killings, desecrations of temples, family murders. Some said he was crazy, consumed by paranoia. Others, who was a victim of court intrigues. But fate did not give him time to redeem himself. While planning new campaigns, a rebellion in Persia lit the chaos spark. Cambyses left to quell her, but died on the road. His body was buried in the sand, and his name became warning whispers. It was then that Dario I appeared, a sharp man and firm hands. His rise to the throne was not peaceful. He had to crush revolts, calm betrayals, and consolidate power with blood and strategy. But once he sat on the throne, he proved to be more than a warrior. He was an empire's architect. Dario understood that a kingdom is not kept alone with swords. He divided the empire into satrapies, provinces governed by satraps that responded directly to him. But he did not give them loose rein. He sent the king's eyes and ears, spies that monitored each movement and maintained order. He created a network of roads that linked the conquered lands, allowing messages and armies to travel with amazing speed. The royal route, which extended from Sardes to Susa, became the backbone of the empire. The merchants, soldiers, and messengers toured it incessantly. No one could match Persian efficiency. The markets flourished, the cities grew, and gold flowed like rivers. But behind that prosperity there was constant surveillance, such precise control that even the weakest murmur of rebellion could be suffocated before it became a scream. Dario also understood the power of symbols. In Persepolis, he made gigantic columns, hearing rooms, and monumental doors that spoke of eternal greatness. It wasn't just a palace, it was a message to the world. Each brick proclaimed the glory of Persia. But he did not rule alone with stone. He created a standard currency system, promoted trade, and respected local cultures. He accepted foreign gods, allowed peoples to maintain their traditions, and presented himself as a fair king, a protector more than a tyrant. However, not everyone saw their power with admiration. On the coast of the Aegean, the Greek colonies of Ionia boiled resentment. For them, Persian control was an invisible chain that suffocated little by little. And while Dario dreamed of expanding his empire to the west, in those small Greek cities they began to form dangerous ideas. Ideas of rebellion, freedom, and resistance. Dario could not ignore those signs. He knew that the flames of the rebellion could extend quickly if they were not turned off on time. He sent emissaries, demanded taxes, and offered warnings. But the Greeks did not listen. And while the news of disturbances in Ionia came to Susa, Dario began to prepare something bigger, an invasion. It would not be just a military campaign. It would be a force test, a blow that would resonate in the known world. In the streets of Athens and Sparta, rumors grew. The Persians were seen as giants, as invincible monsters that came to destroy everything in their path. But not everyone feared. Some saw in the conflict an opportunity to show that chains could break. The sets began to turn on, the spears were sharp, and the boats began to prepare. The Persian, vast and ordered empire would face a small but determined enemy. And while the destination cards were shuffled, the tension in the air was made so dense that it could almost be cut. No one knew how this story would end, but something was safe: the Mediterranean was about to burn. The sun slowly descended on the lands of Greece, dyeing the marble columns and clay roofs. In the narrow streets of Athens, the steps resonated among vendors that offered olives, figs, and wine. In the mountains of Sparta, the echo of swords colliding the air while young warriors trained under the severe look of their instructors. Although they shared language, religion, and traditions, the Greek polis were different worlds, united or culture but separated by invisible walls that divided their ambitions and fears. Athens vibrated with the murmur of voices in the agora, where citizens discussed laws, philosophies, and military strategies. Here, democracy was born as an uncertain but promising flame. It wasn't perfect. Only free men could participate, and women, slaves and foreigners were excluded. But even so, there was something revolutionary in that idea. Power did not belong to a king or a few nobles, but to those who dared to raise their voice. In the hills, the part raised like a silent guardian, witness of the ambitions and fears of its people. Athens breathed art and thought. Philosophers like Socrates challenged minds with questions that bother, and playwrights like Aeschylus wove tragedies that explored human nature. However, under its splendor, Athens also hid cracks. It depended on slaves to sustain their economy and did not hesitate to subdue other cities when he felt threatened. Kilometers away, Sparta stood like an iron bastion. There was no time for speeches or theaters. The Spartans lived for war. Since the age of 7, children were torn from their homes and undergoing brutal training. They learned to resist hunger, ignore pain, and fight until death. For them, discipline was more than a virtue, it was a shield against chaos. Spartan women, although relegated in many areas, enjoyed a freedom that other Greeks could only imagine. They trained physically, administered land, and raised children with the same hardness with which men marched to the battlefield. In Sparta, weakness had no place. His motto was clear: return with the shield or on him. But Sparta's glory had a price. His society depended on the Elotas, enslaved peasants who cultivated the earth while the Spartans prepared for war. It was a fragile system, sustained by fear and strength. Any indication of rebellion was suffocated before I could set fire. Between Athens and Sparta, other polis such as Corinth and Thebes were looking for their own place. Corinth shone for his trade, with ports that connected the Aegean and the Adriatic. Thebes, on the other hand, had a history of changing alliances and betrayals, always willing to challenge those who tried to dominate it. Each city was a world in itself, with laws, armies, and protective gods. But this fragmentation was also its greatest weakness. While the Persians built a unified empire, the Greeks fought among them through land, resources, and power. Wars were constant, ephemeral alliances. However, in the midst of this division, there was something that united them: the myths of heroes such as Hercules, the prophecies of the Oracle of Delphi, and the Olympic Games, where the polis put aside their differences, even if only for a moment. The sea also connected them. The galleys furrowed the waters, carrying goods, ideas, and fears. But the waves also brought threats. The Greek colonies in Asia Minor looked east with restlessness, because they knew that the Persian shadow approached. In the places of Athens, the rumors of invasions grew. In Sparta, the warriors sharpened their swords. Although divided, the Greeks shared a spark that differentiated them from the empires that surrounded them: a fierce love for freedom. For them, being governed by a foreign tyrant was not just a humiliation, it was a death in life. And while the Persians expanded their domain, that spark began to burn. The polis, small but stubborn, were about to be dragged to a conflict that would test everything they were. Their gods would be invoked, their heroes would be remembered, and their lands would be bathed in blood. But they still didn't know. For now, the sun continued to shine on Athens's marble and Sparta iron, while the horizon darkened with war omens. The flames devoured the houses of Sardes, painting the sky with an orange glow while the smoke rose like a silent cry. The roar of fire was mixed with the screams of the defeated Persians and the shouts of triumph of the Jonios. At that time, the Greeks of Asia Minor did not realize that they had lit a spark that would threaten to consume everyone known. It was not another rebellion. It was a direct challenge to the power of Dario I, the King of Kings, and the beginning of a conflict that would change the story forever. The Jonios, Greeks that inhabited the coast of Asia Minor, lived under Persian domain for decades. Its prosperous cities, such as Miletus and Ephesus, were centers of commerce and culture, but also reminders of a free past. The Persians had not destroyed them, they had absorbed them, allowing them to keep their temples and traditions. But under that apparent tolerance, the Jonios felt the weight of submission. They paid tributes, obeyed orders, and saw how their children were taken to wars that were not his. Aristagoras, a tyrant of Miletus, was the man who turned on the flame. Cunning and ambitious, first tried to expand his power with Persian support. But when his plans failed, he feared losing everything. Instead of surrendering, he took a desperate risk he called the rebellion. He promised freedom, land, and revenge. His voice echoed in the squares of the Jonia's cities, waking a fire that had been latent for years. The ships began to be built, the weapons were sharp, and the allies were sought. But Aristagoras knew that the Jonios alone could not face Persian Colossus. He crossed the Aegean Sea for help. He arrived in Athens, where he found ears willing to listen. The Athenians, proud of their young democracy, were attracted to the cause. They didn't see only a distant rebellion, they saw a reflection of their own struggle for freedom. With fervor, they promised 20 ships. Eretria, a small city, also sent 5. For the Persians, that gesture was more than a symbolic help. It was an insult. Athens and Eretria were not just spectators, they had dared to challenge the most powerful empire in the world. And Dario I, upon receiving the news, did not forget it. As they say, he took an arc, shot an arrow towards the sky, and asked the gods' revenge against Athens. Then he ordered a servant who, every night at dinner, would remember, "Lord, remember the Athenians." Meanwhile, the Jonios celebrated their first victories. Sardes, the administrative heart of the Persians in Asia Minor. They burned temples and destroyed stores, sending a clear message: they didn't fear the giant. But the victory was ephemeral. The Persians responded furiously. They gathered an overwhelming army and marched to rebel cities, willing to erase all resistance. The battle became a hunt. The Jonios, despite their courage, could not resist the overwhelming force of the Persian army. Miletus, the jewel of Ionia, fell after a brutal siege. Its inhabitants were killed or sold as slaves. The streets, before full of life, were empty and silent. The flames that had turned on now devoured them. Athens and Eretria, seeing Miletus's fate, understood that they had aroused a monster. Their ships returned home, but they knew that the war was not over. For Dario, the punishment was not complete. Ionia had been crushed, but Athens and Eretria had to pay for their boldness. While the ashes of the Jonia's city still smoked, the Persian messengers crossed mountains and seas, carrying orders to prepare an invasion. The fleets began to gather, and the soldiers were called from the furthest corners of the empire. The roar of the Persian storm approached, and Greece, fragmented and divided, would have to decide whether to face or submit. In Athens, the news of Miletus's destruction fell like a blow. But instead of surrendering to fear, something else began to germinate: determination. Democracy could not bend before a foreign king. In Sparta, the warriors sharpened their swords, aware that their reputation as Greece's most feared were about to be tested. The Persians had demonstrated their strength, but the Greeks had not yet shown everything they were able to do. In the shadows, while the Persian ships furrowed the sea, the Greeks began to prepare for a war that would mark their destiny. The echo of the scream still floated on the ruins of Miletus. The flames had consumed the temples, the walls, and dreams of freedom of the Jonios. But humiliation did not end there. The survivors were chained and dragged as trophies, sold as slaves in distant lands. For Dario I, this punishment was not enough. In the depths of his palace in Persepolis, between golden columns and scented gardens, anger boiled in his chest like a volcano about to explode. The great king did not forgive the offenses. I couldn't. He ruled an empire that extended from the Indo Valley to the Aegean Sea, a mosaic of peoples and cultures united under his power. Allowing insolent Greeks to challenge their authority meant opening the door to more rebellions. The betrayal should be crushed, and its name should be feared even in the world's furthest corners. Every night, as he sat down for dinner, his servant leaned and whispered the words that burned as hot iron in his memory: "Lord, remember the Athenians." And Dario remembered. He remembered the fire that Sardes had devoured, the laughter of the Greeks as they looted their sacred land. He remembered the 20 ships sent by Athens and the 5 of Eretria. Ships that crossed the Aegean as if the Persian Empire was any enemy, not the master of the world. Dario's wrath was not impulsive. It was not the outburst of a weak man. It was the cold and calculated determination of a monarch that had forged an empire based on discipline and strategy. His generals received clear orders: Greece had to fall. But it would not be an impulsive attack. It would be an overwhelming blow, planned with precision to prove that challenging Persia was inviting the disaster. The machinery of the empire began to move. The satrapia, the Persian provinces, responded to the call. Gold, horses, soldiers, and ships were gathered from Egypt, Babylon, Media, and the lands of the Caucasus. The ports were filled with triremes, the coasts echoed with the noise of hammers and screams of slaves building new vessels. The mercenaries were recruited, sharp weapons and Persian archers practiced until their arrows could darken the sky. Persian spies crossed the sea disguised as merchants. They mixed in the Athens markets, listening to conversations, taking note of the defenses and the possible allies. They informed about the divisions between the Greek polis, about the tensions between Athens and Sparta. Dario not only planned an invasion, he planned to sow chaos before throwing the final blow. But there was more than power at stake. For Dario, this war was also a personal matter. He could not allow a small and divided town to humiliate the King of Kings. His divine authority, granted by Ahura Mazda, depended on his ability to govern with a firm hand. The gods had chosen him to bring order to the world, and the Greeks were the symbol of disorder. While the preparations continued, Dario sent emissaries to the Greek polis with a clear message: show or cover to the destruction. He offered them the opportunity to bow and deliver land and water as symbols of obedience. Some cities accepted, fearing the fury of the empire. But Athens and Sparta responded with contempt. In Athens, they threw the emissaries into the abyss. In Sparta, they were killed without hesitation. The news came to Persepolis as a final insult. For Dario, these acts were not gestures of courage, but desperate challenges of convicted peoples. His decision was taken. The first invasion would be fast and devastating. The Persians would disembark in Greece with an army that would make the earth tremble and erase Athens and Eretria of the map. The wind began to blow on the Aegean, carrying the rumors of war. The Greeks watched the horizon, knowing that the Persian storm approached. But what Dario did not know, what no one could foresee, was that this campaign would not be like the others. Greece, with all his division, had something that Persia underestimated: an indomitable will to resist. Persian ships finally left, the candles swollen by the wind. The shadows of the masts lengthened over the water, while the army advanced west. In Athens, citizens gathered in the square, arguing strategies and preparing weapons. In Sparta, the warriors practiced with spears, their eyes as sharp as their leaves. The destination was in motion, and the clash between the east and the west was about to begin. Dario's wrath, relentless like the scorching sun, headed towards Greece. But in the distance, between the mountains and the fields, the resistance of a town that was not willing to bend their knees was already felt. The horizon darkened while the clouds swelled over the Aegean Sea. The wind began as a whisper and soon became a deafening roar. The waves rose like furious giants, hitting Persian ships with ruthless force. Mardonio, the Persian general and son-in-law of Dario I, watched from the deck of his flagship how his imposing fleet was devoured by the storm. His men shouted, prayed, and clung to the strings while the sea, indifferent, claimed ships and lives equally. This was not the triumphal entry that Mardonio had imagined. His mission was clear: to submit to the Trishas tribes and bend the Greeks, starting with Athens and Eretria. The Persian fleet, formed by hundreds of ships, should be the spearhead of an army that would humiliate those who had challenged the power of the King of Kings. But the sea, capricious and brutal, had other plans. The campaign began with confidence. Mardonio, young and ambitious, had been chosen by Dario to lead this expedition not only for his loyalty, but also for his cunning. He had proven to be a brilliant strategist, capable of maintaining order in a vast and diverse empire. His arrival in Thrace was fast and decisive. Local tribes, known for their ferocity and rebellion, fell one after another. His villages were burned, his massacred or enslaved warriors, and their lands absorbed by the growing Persian power. However, the Victoria in Thracia was bitter. The Traces did not give in easily. Its ambush from forests and mountains worn out the Persian troops, accustomed to open battles in plains. The wild terrain of Thrace became an enemy as fearsome as the warriors themselves. Each step towards the interior meant lower, more delays and more uncertainty. While the tribes resisted on land, the real blow came from the sea. When the Persian fleet bordered the peninsula of Mount Athos, the treacherous currents and the wind bursts transformed the journey into a nightmare. The ships, loaded with soldiers, horses, and provisions, were pushed against sharp rocks. The wood created and broke like nuts. The men fell into the water, dragged by the waves or beaten against the remains of the broken ships. It is said that more than 300 boats were lost in the storm, along with thousands of soldiers. The sea, as if they were on the side of the Greeks, devoured the invasion before it could even touch the mainland. Mardonio, humiliated and with the forces decimated, he was forced to retreat. But the storm not only destroyed ships, he also sowed doubts. Among the Persian soldiers, the fear that the Greek gods protected their land began to circulate. The winds that whipped the fleet were not seen as simple natural accidents, but as divine signs. For many, the message was clear: Greece would not be conquered so easily. While Mardonio reorganized what was left of his army, the news of his failure traveled quickly. In Athens, citizens celebrated as if they had already won the war. In Sparta, the warriors sharpened their spears and waited. They knew this was not the end. Dario I would not accept this defeat. In Persepolis, the report came as a direct blow to Dario's pride. His anger, already lit by the Jonic revolt, burned more strongly. It was not just the resistance of the Greeks that enraged it, it was the invisible power that seemed to protect them. For the King of Kings, this defeat was not a warning sign, but a provocation that demanded an even more brutal response. Mardonio's campaign had failed, but his retirement did not mean peace. On the contrary, it was the prelude to something much bigger. The Persians began to gather more ships, more soldiers, and more resources. If the sea had arrested Mardonio, the next expedition would find a way to avoid Mount Athos. This time, Greece would feel the full weight of Persian power. The wind continued to blow on the Aegean, carrying the echo of the storm to the Greek coast. But in the streets of Athens and in the fields of Sparta, the preparation did not stop. The Greeks knew that the enemy would return, bigger, stronger, and more determined. And when they arrived, they would have to face not only an army, but the fury of an empire that did not know defeat. The salty breeze of the Aegean Sea carried the murmur of an inevitable destination. The Persian ships furrowed the waters with their candles tense by the wind, reflecting in its polished with the brightness of the sun. This time, Dario I's army left nothing to chance. Mardonio's defeat had been unbearable humiliation, but also a lesson. Now, the great king not only sought to submit the Greeks, I was looking for revenge. The Persian fleet advanced as an unstoppable swarm, thousands of soldiers squeezed in the ships, with spears and archers ready to dye the Greek lands with blood. Among them were riders and archers of the vast Persian satrapia, men hardened by wars in the arenas of Egypt and the Middle Mountains. The storm that destroyed the first expedition would not be repeated. This time, the fleet avoided the dangerous end of Monte Athos and took a more direct route through the open sea. The objective was clear: destroy Athens and Eretria. Both cities had supported the Ionic revolt, challenging Persia's authority. His acts of rebellion had been like a poison in the skin of the empire, and Dario was determined to tear off that root infection. But before attacking Athens, I had to send a message: no one could resist Persia and survive. Eretria would be the first example. The Persians landed on the island of Euboea with a chilling precision. The city of Eretria, surrounded by green fields and soft hills, was suddenly facing a force that seemed to have arisen from the depths of the sea. Citizens knew that they could not resist for a long time, but they were not willing to surrender without fighting. The resistance began with courage. The Eretria walls were filled with archers who shot arrows against the invasive troops, while the stones rained from the towers. The Persians advanced slowly, protecting themselves with large shields like doors and throwing arrows that darkened the sky. Day after day, the assedio continued, and the city began to crumble from within. The betrayal was the final blow. Some citizens, fearful of losing everything, opened the doors of the city to the Persians. What followed was a brutal and ruthless act. Persian soldiers entered as a death wave, burning temples, looting houses, and dragging the survivors chained as slaves. The Eretria soil was soaked in blood, and its resistance was suffocated under the relentless machinery of the empire. The temples dedicated to the Greek gods burned while the smoke rose like a macabre offering to heaven. The statues were demolished, the sacred writings destroyed. For the Persians, this was not only a military victory, it was a symbolic act. Eretria ceased to exist as a free city and was transformed into a reminder for the rest of Greece: resist meant being annihilated. While the Persian ships sailed again, carrying chained prisoners and the looted loot, the flames of Eretria continued to shine on the horizon. In Athens, rumors arrived quickly. The stories talked about Persian brutality, of fire-devouring temples, children and women taken as slaves. Fear spread like a shadow over the city, but with it the determination also came. The Athenians knew they were the following. Dario would not stop to erase his name from the world. But in the squares and agoras, while the citizens argued the defense plan, something else began to germinate, the hope that perhaps, they could deal with the monster that was approaching. In the sea, the Persians continued advancing. The oars hit the water in an unwavering rhythm. His next destination was already determined. While the coast of Attica appeared on the horizon, the Persian generals prepared their men for what it promised to be the final conquest. But in the Marathon plain, where the golden field spread like a quiet mantle, something expected. Something that the Persians could not foresee. The sun raised on the Marathon plain, spilling its golden light on dust and dry grass. The air was loaded with tension. In front of the Greeks, the infinite line of Persian soldiers shone like a metal river. Thousands of spears pointed to heaven, and the armor shone under the sun. The invasion had arrived. This was the battle that would decide the fate of Athens. And perhaps throughout Greece. The Athenians were few compared to the Persian army. Just 10,000 hoplites formed the army of Athens, reinforced by a small contingent of 1,000 stall soldiers. The Persians, on the other hand, had more than 20,000 men, archers, riders, and the dreaded warriors of Oriental Satrapia. The difference was overwhelming, and yet the Greeks did not go back. Milesiades, the Athenian strategist, observed the battlefield with hawk eyes. He knew that Persian force resided in his archers and in the mobility of his cavalry. But I also knew that the Persians trusted the fear they inspired. The Greeks, on the other hand, had something that the Persians did not understand: the indestructible bond among free citizens fighting for their home. The Milesiades strategy was bold. Instead of forming a uniform line, he weakened the center of his army and reinforced the flanks. It was a risky tactic, but designed to surround the enemy at the decisive moment. When the signal arrived, the hoplites charged. They did not walk. They did not wait to be reached by the Persian arrows. They ran. The earth trembled under the steps of the Greeks as they advanced as an unstoppable wave. The Persians fired their arrows, obscuring the sky, but the hoplites raised their shields and continued running. The distance closed in an instant. The clash was brutal. The sound of spears breaking and war shouts filled the air. In the center, the Greeks were pushed back. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority, opened gaps and began to surround the hoplites. But then the unexpected happened. The Greek, thicker and stronger flanks crushed the Persian forces at the ends. Like a hammer that hits from both sides, the Greeks wrapped the enemy. Chaos seized the Persian army. His ranks broke. The soldiers began to go back, first in small groups and then in mass. The Greeks did not give them truce. They chased the invaders to the seashore, where the Persians desperately tried embarking to escape. The waters stained red. Hoplites, covered with dust and blood, rose between the bodies. They had defeated the most powerful army in the known world. The Persians left more than 6,000 dead in the field, while the Greeks barely lost about 200 men. But victory did not bring rest. On the horizon, the Persian candles could still be seen. Some ships turned to Athens, hoping to take the unprotected city. Milesiades did not waste time. He sent a messenger, Philippides, who ran without stopping to Athens, touring the 40 kilometers between Marathon and the city. Upon arriving, panting and with the heart at the edge of exploding, he could only pronounce a word before collapsing: Nike. Victoria. Philippids' warning was enough for Athens to prepare. When the Persians arrived, they found the defendant walls and the Athenian spirit enraged by victory. They did not dare to disembark. In silence, their ships moved away towards the horizon. In the Marathon plain, the Greeks gathered their dead and buried them with honors. On the earth they had defended with their lives, they raised a burly to remember their sacrifice. However, while the Athenians celebrated, Persia's shadows did not disappear. This battle had been just the beginning. Dario I would not forget this defeat. His wounded pride would demand reprisals. And in the heart of Persia, the fire of revenge was already on. The sun was put on the Aegean Sea, but in the hearts of the Athenians, the brightness of victory still illuminated the horizon. They had defeated the imposing Persian war machine in Marathon, but the price of that victory would be something that they could not even understand at that time. The tension, now that the dust of the battle began to settle, was far from dissipating. In Athens, faces mixed between joy and concern. The Marathon victory was a symbol of hope, a reminder that, even when everything seemed lost, the spirit of a united city could challenge fate. But the terror of the invasion had not disappeared, it had only been postponed. Although the Persians had retired for now, the waters of the Aegean Sea remained the same, and the candles of the Persian ships, although distant, always represented a threat. Dario's empire would not easily forget his humiliation. The anger of a king who had been defeated, especially by a people who considered him lower, was forged in something more dangerous than an army, the desire for revenge. In Persia, the news of the defeat resonated as an echo of rage in the halls of the palace of Susa. Dario, with his hardening face for years of conquests, did not tolerate failure. Marathon was not only a military defeat, but a challenge to his authority. The image of his best soldiers raised by a much lower Greek army should be erased. The humiliation burned in his heart, and the fury became a silent cry of war. It was inevitable that, with the passage of time, Persia prepared to return. Dario could not allow the world to think that his power was limited. The answer should be overwhelming. The resources of the empire were launched, and a new invasion against Greece began to take shape. In the vast plains of Asia Minor, the armies were reorganized. The fleets were reinforced with more ships, more men, more archers. This time, the invasion would be much more than a simple punishment. It would be the attempt to erase Athens from the face of the map. Athens, aware of the imminent threat, began to prepare for the worst. The triumph in Marathon had not given them time to relax. Rather, he had driven them to be even more cautious. The resources were channeled in the construction of walls and the formation of new alliances. While Marathon's victory had shown that they could resist the Persians, they knew that next time could not be so easy. The Athenians knew that war would be long and bitter, but their determination was fierce. They no longer struggled for their city, they fought for their freedom, for the future of all Greece. The doors of the polis were closed with a bleak hope. The soldiers trained with sweat on the forehead and scars of the past. Women, the elderly and children prepared provisions to where that war, perhaps more cruel and ruthless than ever, would hinder themselves over them. The shadow of the Persians cindered over the city again. In the political sphere, Athens joined other Greek cities. Sparta, the rival city-state who previously looked at Athens with disdain, now understood the urgency of the moment. The Persian threat united them in a way that would never have imagined. The fragmented Greece, with its small internal disputes, was forced to put its differences aside to face a common enemy. But the unit was fragile. Although the short-term interests coincided, the old rivalries between Athens and Sparta remained latent under the surface, such as a silent poison waiting for the time to resurface. Marathon's story would be marked in the Greek books as one of the most notable victories, but also as a constant reminder that war was never completely won. The Persians would return, and with them, the old questions: could the Greeks resist again? Or would this be the last spark of freedom before darkness? The preparations were exhaustive. The Athenians trained with determination, but also with a touch of despair. They knew what was at stake, not only the future of their city, but the very existence of their culture and their way of life. In their hearts the echo of battle throbbed, as an incessant call to action. Marathon's memory kept them standing, but the fear of Persian revenge pushed them to move on. Fear could not paralyze them, but they couldn't ignore it either. Thus, on the quiet nights of Athens, when the wind blew gently between the columns of the temples, the people murmured stories of the battle that had made the difference. But beyond the stories, beyond victorious songs, there was the cruel reality: the Persians had not been defeated forever. And whatever came later could be even worse. King Dario had died, and with his departure, Persia not only lost a leader, but also an empire that throbbed under his will of iron. But while the screams of lament for Dario's death still resonated in the houses of the Persians, in the golden halls of the palace, a new roar began to be heard. A man raised, a gloomy figure whose name would freeze the blood of anyone who faced him. Era Xerxes, son of Dario, who with the fury inherited from his father, intended to continue the dream of revenge that had not been achieved in Marathon. The rise of Xerxes to the throne was not just a change of power, it was the rebirth of the promise of destruction. While assuming his position, his eyes shone with a dark fire. From his marble throne, Xerxes looked at the world as a god watching his subjects. His father's defeat could not be unpunished. Hate for the Greeks had incarnated in him, and his thirst for revenge seemed insatiable. The shadow of his kingdom was extended throughout the vast Persian Empire, and Xerxes began to draw his way to glory. But it was not only revenge. It was a matter of honor, a way to demonstrate that Persia, under his domain, remained the undisputed power of the world. The Athenians had not only faced their army, they had injured their dignity. Now, the only thing that filled Xerxes' mind was the image of Greece humiliated under his boots. The preparations for the invasion were imposing, almost mystical in their magnitude. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers began to form under Persian command. The roar of war drums resonated from the borders of India to the coast of the Aegean. It was as if the whole empire was being dragged towards a single goal. The resources were mobilized at a speed that scared even the most powerful in the court. Persian fleets were assembled with unusual speed and organization. Thousands of warships aligned along the coasts of the empire, loaded with archers, infants, riders, and all kinds of troops. The coastal cities, such as Susa and Babylon, emptied resources while the war machinery was launched. The messengers went from one end to another, carrying orders for recruitment, transport, and arms manufacturing. Persia spared no effort. What was to come would be bigger, more fierce, and more unstoppable than anything that the world would have seen. However, the magnitude of this army was not its only terrifying component. The Persians, led by Xerxes, also possessed a vision, that of an empire whose power could not be challenged. The traces of the past, the victories of Ciro el Grande, Dario's legacy, everything that Persia had built should be reaffirmed in the humiliation of the Greeks. With every month that passed, the preparations intensified. Xerxes left nothing to chance. In every corner of the empire, his army became bigger. Thousands of men built floating bridges on Hellesponto and Bosphorus, creating passages so that the Persian army could cross between Asia and Europe without obstacles. Persia's military technology and power seemed to exceed any limit. The organization that the Persians showed was incomparable. Their figures were not just great, they were overwhelming. Each step towards Greece was a threat that added to the fear that sent over the hearts of the Greeks. The temples were filled with sacrifices to the gods. The flames burned high, but the shadows of the invasion of Xerxes could not be turned off. In the same courts of the Persian nobility, there were murmurs about the punishment that was coming. It was said that Xerxes had never felt closer to fulfilling his father's dream. The world in terror would fall under the weight of revenge. In Greece, meanwhile, the rumors of Persian advances arrived as a cold wind that froze the soul. It was not only an army. It was a monster made of thousands of men, horses, weapons, and ships. Greek cities, some like Athens, prepared for a war like never before. The fear of a Persian attack was imminent, and with him, a feeling of despair mixed with the desire to resist. The same streets of Athens, one day full of joy and philosophy, were now filled with restlessness and anguish. The conversations in the squares, before about politics and theater, now revolved around war, resistance, and death. However, while Persia wove his destruction network, there was something that neither Xerxes nor their generals could predict: the unity of the Greeks. The war that was coming would not only be an army's war, but also a war of wills, of cultures. The strength of the Greek spirit, of the men who loved their freedom and their land, rose as a difficult flame to turn off. But that, of course, would be something that Xerxes would learn very soon, when the waves of the Aegean began to clear not only their ships, but also the weight of their revenge. In the darkness of the Persian threat, something deeply unexpected began to take shape in the heart of Greece. The internal tensions that used to divide Greek cities, the same ones that had prevented them from joining in the past, vanished as smoke before the roar of the war that was coming. The gods seemed to have taken their gaze on the fragmented peoples of the Aegean, and the need for unity became more urgent with every day that passed. The villages and the polis, always distrustful of each other, were now forced to form a common front. Thus was born the Hellenic League, a coalition of forces that joined with the sole purpose of curbing the monstrous Persian invasion that threatened to destroy everything. The leader of this alliance was Leonidas himself, the Spartan king, whose iron will represented the pillar of this precarious union. But the decision to form a league did not come easy. In Athens, citizens did not see with good eyes the alliance with those who looked like rivals. Sparta, with his militaristic and authoritarian culture, was not the ideal ally for Athenian democratics. However, the threat of Xerxes united what neither gold nor promises could have achieved. The situation demanded action, and, as Persian troops approached, the Greek struggle spirit began to resurface. The leaders of the polis, full of distrust, exchanged words with eyes full of suspicion, but everyone knew that their survival depended on one thing: unity. The idea of forming a Hellenic League was more an act of despair than an act of trust. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, and many other cities, with their own interests and priorities, now had to learn to fight together, to put aside their differences. Uniting forces was not only a strategic need, but also a symbol of resistance against a common enemy that did not understand internal divisions. But within that apparent unit, tensions did not disappear. The Spartans, with their army trained for war, saw the Athenians as an inexperienced force in direct combat, although undoubtedly shone in the naval strategy. Athens, meanwhile, felt that its naval power was the key to a victory, while the Spartans did not share this vision. The discussions on how to coordinate the forces, on what resources to share, on what should be the strategy to follow, were inevitable. The leadership in war, of course, was another thorny issue. Sparta, with his victory story in battles, wanted to impose his hegemony, but Athens, with his democracy, was not going to give in so easily. Meanwhile, in the streets of the main Greek cities, people began to feel that the weight of history fell on their shoulders. Men, women, children, everyone knew that what was coming would be the last opportunity to defend their way of life. The troops were trained, stored foods, sharp weapons, but in the hearts of Greek soldiers there was something that could not even understand: the desire for freedom. Somehow, this fight, which was already deeply marked by violence and politics, became much more visceral. It was a struggle for survival, for the right to remain who they were. But below all this preparation, distrust persisted. The Spartans would never forget that Athens had shown an aversion to their military methods. And Athens, meanwhile, could not forget what I saw: how the rigidity and implacability of the Spartans. War would not only unite the Greeks contra the Persians, but would also test their internal alliances. The Hellenic League, born of the need, was like a tensioned rope to the fullest, ready to break if someone loosen it. And meanwhile, on the coast of Asia Minor, the eyes of the Persians were nailed with disdain over this divided town. Xerxes, confident in his power, saw the internal dissension of the Greeks as an advantage. The Persians knew that victory, although not assured, was within reach. But what they did not know was that the true enemy for them was not only the Greek army, but the indomitable spirit of its people, a spirit that began to forge in every corner of the Hellade, even among those who hated deeply. The leaders of the Hellenic League knew that their struggle would not only be a military, but also psychological. Each step taken, each decision made, was loaded with tensions, of the possibility of betrayal, of the pressure of the unit. It was a career against time, a desperate attempt to get the impossible. But while the Greek ships aligned in the Aegean, and the troops trained, something else had begun to be born: hope. A hope that the Greeks, at least for a moment, shared. The floating bridge of the Hellespont, one of the most impressive feats of the military engineering of ancient Persia, was erected as a symbol of the indomitable determination of Xerxes. This bridge not only represented a physical crossing of the waters that separated Asia from Europe, but also marked the culminating moment of an empire willing to overwhelm the limits of nature itself to achieve victory. The Hellespont, the strait that separates the current Turkey from the Balkan Peninsula, had always been a natural barrier for the armies of invaders. The Persians, however, had the advantage of having vast resources and an organizational capacity that allowed them to overcome the most complex obstacles. Under the direct orders of Xerxes, thousands of workers were gathered to create a floating bridge that crossed the strait. This would be the first decisive step of the Persian invasion of Greece. The construction of the floating bridge was a monumental process that lasted weeks. It consisted of a series of ships aligned in such a way that they formed a continuous surface, supported by cables and ropes that kept them together. To these ships were added wooden planks and other structures, creating a solid platform on which the Persian army could cross. The magnitude of this engineering work was amazing. It was as if the ocean himself was subject to the will of Xerxes, a challenge to nature itself. However, the floating bridge was not exempt from difficulties. The first construction attempts were destroyed by a fierce storm that swept the Hellespont, plunging Xerxes into an unstoppable fury. According to the historical stories, the Persian king, enraged by the defeat before the forces of nature, ordered that those responsible be punished and that the strait be beaten with whips and chains as a sign of his disdain for the stubborn resistance of the sea. However, the dream of invading Greece could not be stopped by the capricious tides. The Persians rebuilt the bridge with even greater diligence and finally managed to complete, offering invaders a direct route towards Europe. The crossing of the Hellespont marked the beginning of the Persian march towards Greece. With the bridge instead, Xerxes' vast army could begin his invasion without obstacles. Throughout the months prior to the invasion, the Persian monarch had gathered one of the most impressive military forces in ancient history. It is estimated that its army exceeded 1 million men, including infants, riders, archers, engineers, and logistic support. The exact numbers vary according to the sources, but the magnitude of the invasion was undeniable. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, and even natives of the most remote regions of the empire joined under the flag of Xerxes to crush the Greeks. The advance towards Greece was meticulously planned. After crossing the Hellespont, the Xerxes army advanced rapidly through Thrace, sweeping the lands on its way. The peoples that were in their path were subjected, and those who offered resistance were brutally punished. The Persian war technique was simple but effective, using numerical force, brutality, and terror to demoralize any people who interposed on their way. As he advanced, Xerxes established camps along the way, ensuring logistics to supply his huge army. The vastness of Persian territory, together with the discipline of their army, allowed them to move quickly. The march towards Greece was unstoppable. The enthusiasm of Persian soldiers was palpable. They saw in each city that fell under his domain a closer victory, a victory that would avenge the humiliation suffered by Dario in Marathon. However, despite the imposing magnitude of the march, Persia was not exempt from challenges. The resistance of Greek cities and the lack of unity among them remained a concern for Xerxes. Although many underwent without fighting, other cities decided to stand up to the invaders. The Greeks, despite their political fragmentation, realized that the danger they faced was greater than any internal rivalry. The union of forces was brewing little by little, and the news of Persian advances began to summon the Greek warriors to weapons. War was not only a matter of territorial defense, but a matter of cultural survival. With the Persian army marching through the Macedonia region and the Greeks calling their forces for resistance, everything was reduced to an inevitable confrontation. The Persian advance towards Greece was unstoppable, but in the air the question that would never stop resurfaced was floating: would they be the Greeks capable of joining their forces to face this unprecedented threat, or would they fall before the numerical superiority of Persia? The Persian march and the construction of the floating bridge symbolized more than the pure invasion of a territory. They represented the clash between two worlds, two cultures, two civilizations. In the Hellespont Strait, where the waters joined Asia and Europe, the hopes and destinations of thousands of people who, although separated by distance and customs, would be dragged by the same conflict were also crossed. a conflict that would decide not only the future of Greece, but also that of the entire Old World. The darkness of the morning was full of promises and fear, as if the land itself feared what was about to happen. In the narrow passage of Thermopylae, a war scenario that could have been a fable of courage or despair, was the last bastion of hope for all Greece. A few hundred men prepared to face an army of millions. These were not common warriors, they were Spartans, led by their king, Leonidas. Although the sun had not yet looked completely on the horizon, the air was already heavy, as if presuming the magnitude of what was about to happen. The Persians, under the command of Xerxes, advanced with the same determination with which their empire expanded. The human tide was unstoppable, thousands of Persian soldiers, Media, Babylonians, Egyptians, and warriors of distant regions, all united by the same goal, to defeat Greece. However, in the passage of Thermopylae, just a handful of men interposed between them and the advance towards the heart of the Greek earth. The Spartans, with their temperate steel and even harder hearts, were determined to delay the endless horde of Xerxes. With them were some Greek allies, but the bravery of the Spartans was the one that stood out, the one that resonated strongly in the air. Leonidas, king of Sparta, knew that this battle was not just a matter of life or death for his little contingent. It was a matter of honor, of preservation of what they represented, freedom, autonomy, the culture of a people that refused to be subjugated. I knew that they would probably not survive. But still, his decision was clear. He was willing to die in that step, if that meant giving Greece the opportunity to join and resist. Sparta's memory, the strength of his people, was forged in that sacrifice. With his high shield and his sharp spear, Leonidas led the load, a man surrounded by the metallic brightness of his army of warriors trained in the art of war. In the Thermopylae, the narrowness of the land played in their favor, limiting the movements of the Persian army and allowing the Spartans to use their infallible tactic, the phalanx. In the formation of shields, each Spartan was an impenetrable wall, a solid block that formed a mobile strength. The battle became a resistance game, where the Spartan warriors, armed with courage and experience, remained firm, rejecting the attacks of the Persians over and over again. The cries of the combatants, the clashes of the metals, and the rumble of the steps of the soldiers were the sounds that filled the air. The Persians, as many as they were, could not break the formation. But the nature of war is cruel, and everything had a price. The passage of the Thermopylae, where the Spartans had deposited all their hope, became a trap. Xerxes' forces were not only great, but they were also in command of a man whose desire for revenge and glory had no limits. And in the chaos of the fight, when the light of day began to shine more intensely, a traitor emerged from the shadows, giving the stake it gives mortal to Greek hope. A man named Ephialtes, a Greek who had been displaced by the hardness of life in his own land, betrayed his brothers of war. Guiding the Persians on a hidden path, he diverted his army to the Greek rear. It was a simple, but devastating maneuver. Ephialtes' betrayal meant that Spartans could no longer stand firm in the narrow steppe. The force that had maintained them standing, the certainty that the defendant terrain was his and only his, vanished in the blink of an eye. Leonidas, aware of betrayal, knew that defeat was inevitable. The news of the Persian army approach for the rear came to its ear, and with it, the understanding that there was no longer. His men struggled with bravery, but the truth quoted on them as a shadow, they were surrounded. However, the Spartan king did not falter. In a last act of heroism, he and his warriors continued fighting, defending the steppe to the last breath. The fall in Thermopylae was not just a military defeat. It was a moment that marked Greece, a moment that shaped his destiny. Through spilled blood in the passage, the Greeks found their union, their resolution. Although Leonidas and his warriors fell, his sacrifice was not in vain. The memory of his courage ignited a spark in the Greek cities. The resistance had begun, and although the war was far from finishing, something had changed forever. The tragedy of Thermopylae was not only a defeat on the battlefield, but a reminder that the struggle for freedom, for what one believes, always comes with a cost. But in the end, that sacrifice was the lighthouse that illuminated the road to the final victory. The history of Leonidas and the Spartans would live in the hearts of the Greeks, reminding them that, although a man may fall, the strength of his spirit can inspire thousands. The night had already fallen over Athens, but the city still seemed to vibrate with a disturbing calm. The smoke slowly rose from the surroundings, as if the city itself breathed one last time before the chaos devoured it completely. The Athenians, aware of the threat that hidden over them, felt a knot in the stomach, a sensation that frozen their bones. They knew that the Persian invasion was imminent, and the streets, normally bustling, were deserted. The cries of the town had been silenced, replaced by murmurs of anguish and the sound of the hurried steps. In the distance, the Xerxes' army advanced. It was an endless human tide, a torrent of soldiers, cars, and horses, which was approaching with a cold determination. The city of Athens, with its venerated temples and its glorious history, was in the sights of the Persian Empire. No one could escape the magnitude of the destruction that was coming. The Athenians, cornered and with their hearts divided, knew they could not fight against such a vast army. The battle was already lost before he began. The great looting began at dawn. The doors of the city opened, not by the will of the Athenians, but by the force of the Persians. At first, it was a rumble, a deafening noise that filled the air, followed by the first flames that illuminated the sky. The temples, the houses, the monuments that represented so much for the Athenians, quickly became ashes. The Parthenon, symbol of the glory of Athens, soon fell under the destructive fire of the invaders. The marble columns, which had resisted the passage of the centuries, collapsed as if they were nothing more than dust. The Athenian families, who until the previous day had lived with hope and pride, were dragged by a reality that they could not understand. Many fled, leaving their home, their culture, their memories behind. The faces of men, women, and children reflected fear, despair, and impotence. They had witnessed the fall of their city, the collapse of their world. With a broken heart, they began to leave the walls, running towards the port of El Pirau, towards the security offered by the flight to Salamina. The city, which had been a lighthouse of art and knowledge, was now being devoured by fire. The laughter of children, the bustle of markets, the speeches of philosophers and debates in the squares, all that vanished under the shadow of destruction. The history of Athens, the city that had challenged Persian power, seemed to be reduced to a sad memory. However, in the midst of this chaos, there was a spark of resistance. Athens would not give up so easily. Citizens, although terrified and confused, gathered in the port of El Pirau, the look fixed on the horizon, where the sea offered an exit. The Athenian fleet, composed of rapid and agile triremes, was their last waiting zie. Through an act of courage and determination, many embarked on their ships, leaving behind the city that had been their home. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Athens, the looting continued. Persian soldiers, fed by hatred and desire for revenge, not only destroyed the physical city, but also tried to erase their soul. The statues of the gods, the libraries full of knowledge, everything that represented Athens, such as the cradle of civilization, was being reduced to rubble. The flames illuminated the night, as a cruel reminder of what was lost. The decision to leave Athens was difficult, one of those decisions that marked a before and after in people's lives. The families divided, some were left behind to try to protect what they could, others entered the sea. The evacuation toward Salamina was an act of despair, but also of resistance. There was no time for regret, only for flight. As the ships moved away, the Athenians of their razed city, pain and uncertainty settled in their hearts. What would be from Athens after all this? Would it be possible to rebuild it sometime? They did not know what would hold the future, but something inside them was still burning. The flame of hope, although weak, was still on. Athens burning was not only a physical disaster, but also a devastating blow to the moral of the Greeks. The city had been its pride, its symbol of freedom and democracy, and was now being destroyed before its eyes. But at the same time, the loss did not mean its end. The sacrifice of Athens, the flight to Salamina, would mark the beginning of a new phase in the war. What had been destroyed could be rebuilt, what was lost could be recovered. Although the city burned in flames, in the hearts of the Athenians a light still shone, the determination to fight for its freedom until the last breath. The sea was calm, almost too serene for what was about to happen. The Athenians, refugees in their ships after burning their city, watched the horizon with a heart full of fear and hope. The Persian threat was bigger than ever, but there was more than united them, the desire for survival. The Salamina Strait, between the island and the coast, was the scene of what would be the decisive battle, but, until that moment, nobody knew how it would develop. Themistocles, the Athenian commander, remained silent, his look fixed on the horizon. I knew the situation was desperate. His fleet was not as large as Persian, and Xerxes' ships were designed to crush. But Thebes had something that the Persians did not have: cunning. A thought was around his mind, a bold plan that would change the course of war. The trust he showed on his face hid a deep sacrifice, but it was that sacrifice that would bear fruit. The night before the battle, Themistocles sent a secret message to the Persians. He offered them a false promise of surrender. A lure. The hope that the Athenians would submit, that they accepted their defeat. The message was received by Xerxes, who, confident in his victory, believed that the surrender of the Athenians was assured. But what I didn't know was that Themistocles had launched a trap. With the Persian fleet deployed throughout the strait, the Athenian commander waited for his moment. The morning came as an omen of what was coming. The winds were favorable, and the Athenian ships were ready. Themistocles had arranged to his forces in key positions, and the Persian fleet, excessively larger, was trapped in the strait, where its massive size would be its greatest weakness. It was a mortal narrowing. The Athenians, moving with speed and agility, attacked from all angles. Persian numerical superiority was reduced to nothing against the cunning and skill of the Greeks. The first phase of the battle was confusing. The sound of the swords colliding, the cracking of the wooden ships, the roar of the sea mixed with the cries of the combatants. The Persians tried to form a strong front, but the narrow strip of water limited their maneuverability. The Greeks, with their agility, attacked where they could always one step forward. Athenian ships cut the water with deadly precision, ramming and destroying Persian ships with a fury that seemed endless. But the real turn of the battle came when Themistocles, in an unexpected maneuver, threw its ships towards the center of the strait, just when the wind began to change. The Persians, trapped everywhere, began to mess. The Persian fleet, which was massive, was unable to maneuver effectively in the strait. The ships collided with each other, creating total confusion. The Athenian they did not miss the opportunity. To every blow they gave, the hopes of an empire collapsed that believed to have everything under control. Xerxes, from his throne, observed impotent the defeat of his forces. The fury of the Greeks was overwhelmed, and the confidence of the Persian king collapsed with each sunk ship. The sound of the battle, of the war that was fought for survival, rumbled in his ears. In his mind, he could still not understand that a small Greek fleet could face his imposing army. But the evidence was before his eyes. The Salamina Strait was the tomb of his hope. The sun began to fall, and the sea was dyed with a deep red color. Persian ships, unable to resist the Athenian attack, sank one after another. The battle became a desperate escape, a failed attempt to save what was left of the Xerxes Empire. The Salamina Strait had been the scene of one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of Persia, and the echo of that defeat would resonate throughout the empire for generations. For the Athenians, the sacrifice had been worth it. The fury of the Persian army had been defeated, and with it, the threat that hung over Greece had been dissipated. But it was not only the victory that made Themistocles great, but the cunning with which it orchestrated the Persian defeat. He had played with the hope of Xerxes, creating a deadly trap that sank the Persian fleet in the same strait that seemed to give them advantage. And while the Athenians celebrated the victory, Greece's future had changed forever. The Battle of Salamina not only meant the defeat of an empire, but the rebirth of a civilization. The value of the men who fought there, facing the tide of history, would resonate through the centuries. Because, although the Persian Empire had fallen, the idea of freedom, of unity, of resistance to oppression, was born in the seas of Salamina, and could never be erased. The winter of 480 to 479 BC. It was a pause in the sea of chaos, an unwavering truce that offered no calm, but the pressure of what was about to come. While the waves calmed down, the war clouds did not dissipate, an uncertainty hidden over the future of Greece. After the imposing defeat in Salamina, the Persian Empire could not afford to lose everything that had conquered in its western road. Xerxes' forces were reorganized, seeking to recover control and prepare their revenge. On the other side, Greek city-states, together with the common threat, breathed cautiously, but knew that the fight was not yet ended. In the heart of the Persian campaign, King Xerxes, although injured in his pride, was not willing to surrender. Their forces were regrouped, reorganized in the Tebas region, one of the key cities that offered the Persians a strategic basis to continue their progress. There, the Persians were trying to regroup their forces, reinforce their positions, and prepare the land for a renewed attack. Winter was the time for the construction, recovery of troops, ship repair, and the restructuring of an army that, although defeated, remained formidable. On the other hand, winter also offered the Greeks the opportunity to consolidate their victories and reflect on what this respite meant. After Salamina, the Athenians did not celebrate victory with excesses, but with a deep reflection. They knew that the war was not won, that their survival depended on how they would regroup and the fortress they could gather for the next battle. The internal tensions between the polis, although minimal, never disappeared, and the fear of Persian power remained a constant shadow. Athens, for example, was devastated. Its citizens had lost everything: their homes, their temples, their daily lives. However, his spirit did not break. There was a determination in their hearts, a desire for resistance that was forged in the forge of the loss. Many Athenians took refuge in nearby islands, hoping that the calm of winter was just a prelude to the final storm. They knew that the following decisions would be crucial. Winter was not only a respite for the Persians, but also for them. In the north, in Thebes, the situation was different. The Persians were losing ground, but they still had the power to give a fatal blow. The city, although not completely loyal to Xerxes, had been a strategic support point. Meanwhile, the Persian troops that had taken refuge there were prepared for a counterattack, training and fortifying in the region. In the halls of the barracks, the discontent for the defeat of Salamina was palpable, but the discipline of the Persian army remained intact, and the dream of Xerxes' revenge remained firm. Greek forces, however, do not rest a ban. Although the Battle of Salamina had given them a respite, they knew that the threat had not disappeared. Winter was just a high on the road before the final shock. The leadership of Greek generals remained firm, although distrust between some polis still existed. Sparta, with his militarized army, always willing to fight until the end, saw with suspicion the growing power of Athens. The fear of the expansion of his influence was palpable in the halls of the Spartan palaces. But the situation demanded unity, and the Greeks understood that the only way to survive was to stay together, at least for the moment. With winter, the strategy was slowly deployed. The Persians continued in Thebes, regrouping their forces, looking for allies and strengthening their army. But while the ice covered the northern lands, Xerxes' key decisions were taken secret. The darkness of the season did not hide his desire for revenge. I wanted a decisive victory, one that erased the bitter memory of the defeat in Salamina. There was a sense of urgency, as if the Persian Empire could no longer afford more failures. But the internal voices that whispered doubts about the war against the Greeks drowned under the pressure of the king, who could not conceive another defeat. In the Greek lands, the tension accumulated with every day that passed. The resistance was strengthened, but internal frictions also grew. Athens and Sparta, two of the main forces on the front, constantly discussed the best way to proceed. Sparta, with his strong army, wanted to confront the Persians with total force, while Athens, with their cunning and naval capacity, favored a more cautious strategy, always looking for the favorable terrain. There was a constant struggle not only against the Persians, but also within the same Greek coalition. And so, winter passed, with the war that remained a constant presence, waiting for the moment to explode again. Xerxes' forces in Thebes couldn't expect much more. The Persian Empire was reorganized with the same determination with which its expansion had begun. In Greece, the polis reinforced their defenses, rebuilt what they had lost and, with a mixture of anxiety and hope, prepared for what was to come. The heat of spring will not only bring the renewal of nature, but also the renewal of war. And what happens when the ice melts, when the last snow layer disappears? It will be a confrontation that will decide the fate of two worlds, two cultures that have been marked by the shadow of a conflict that seems endless. The quiet of the morning was almost thick. The plates of platar, covered with dew, seemed to ignore the tremendous weight on them. Sun rays barely peeked between the mountains when the armies aligned, some facing the last chance to save their honor, and others with the firmness of knowing that the future of their freedom was at stake. The battle would not only mark the fate of a region, but would be the conclusion of a war that had dragged whole empires at the edge of destruction. The Persians, after being defeated in Salamina and Thermopylae, had tried to go back to the Greeks, still hoping to forge their final victory. The figure of Xerxes remained powerful, and despite the defeat in the sea, the Persians maintained considerable force. But the war had worn his troops. In Plataea, Xerxes trusted once again in his general, Mardonio, who had been the brain behind the last campaigns. Meanwhile, on the Greek side, Commander Pausanias, general of the Spartans, prepared for a confrontation that defined not only his army, but to an entire uncertain future. The tension that was breathed in the air was unbearable. On the one hand, the Greek forces had joined, despite their internal differences. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful cities, now fought side by side, with a fierce determination. But everyone's eyes were put in Pausanias. The Spartan general, with his composure and discipline, had to lead the last burden, which would decide whether the Persian invasion would be a closed chapter or a scar that would mark Greece forever. The Persian army, still numerous, did not possess the same morale as at the beginning of the conflict. The fight had been long, and the memory of the defeats weighed on their shoulders. The sun that raised slowly over the hills seemed, in some way, to presage that the victory was no longer on its side. Mardonio, who had stopped trusting Xerxes' plans, knew that this battle could be his last chance to redeem his reputation and Persian power in the region. The tension between Persian soldiers was palpable, some already they looked at the horizon, waiting for a withdrawal that would never come. On the Greek side, Pausanias felt the pressure of great responsibility. Not only was Greece's last defense line, but the victory or defeat would fall on his shoulders. The Spartan military force was known for its unwavering discipline, but Pausanias also understood the importance of cunning and strategy. The Plataea battle would not only be a physical confrontation, but a clash of wills. And he, as a leader, should show that the unity between the Greek polis was more powerful than any foreign army. With a single gesture, silence broke. The armies faced a fury that seemed to come from centuries of history. The weapons collided, the cries of the men rose, and the bodies fell to the ground covered with blood. The fight extended along the field, and the wind brought with it the echo of an already written destination. The Persians, with their imposing formations, beat fiercely, but something was perceived in their advance, an uncertainty, a doubt that stopped them. Maybe they already knew that the turn they feared was about to happen. And then, Pausanias did what seemed unthinkable. He did not immerse himself in the fight as the other generals, but coordinated the battle from the center, handling the Greek forces with incredible precision. The decisive moment came when, with a strategic command, the Spartan forces surrounded the Persians, attacking the flanks and breaking their defense line. It was a calculated, but brave maneuver. While sweat and blood covered the faces of the soldiers, Pausanias observed how their enemies crumbled at the accuracy of their attack. The battle began to lean irremediably in favor of the Greeks. Mardonio, seeing how his army crumbled, tried a last effort to reorganize his troops, but it was too late. The Persians, overwhelmed and with destroyed morals, could not resist anymore. The defeat was imminent, and the Plataea field became a sea of chaos, with soldiers that fled, abandoning their destiny between the shadows of despair. The wind blew stronger, bringing with him the salty flavor of the Greek victory. The Persians, with the face marked by sweat and defeat, were trapped between the spears and swords of a determined army. Pausanias did not let the battle extend more than necessary. The victory, finally, was yours. The flame of the Greek resistance, on for so many previous losses, had reached its peak. While the Greeks celebrated victory, the echo of Persian defeat felt throughout the field. The weight of the war had been overwhelming, but Greek determination and heroism had finally prevailed. Pausanias, although victorious, did not celebrate with shouts of joy. He knew that true victory was not only about the Persians, but about the uncertainty that had marked the history of his people. Plataea spilled blood was not only a tribute to the battle won, but an offering to the future, to the freedom that was ensured by the price of courage. And while the Greeks celebrated, the shadow of what would still be floated on them. It had been a victory, yes, but the story would not stop there. Peace was just a dream, one that vanished in the mist of a conflict that seemed endless. The sun began to wear, staining the horizon with red and orange tones, as if the same nature presages the imminent clamor of the battle. The tension floated in the air, dense, heavy. The seas, in quiet appearance, were the scene of a struggle that would change the course of the war. On the coast of Mycala was the fate of the Persian fleet, and with it, the future of the Jonic cities that still maintained the heavy burden of Persian oppression on their shoulders. Uncertainty felt in the air. Persian ships, with their wind fans, aligned with an impeccable order, such as a floating wall of wood and iron. The Persian general Tigrans, confident in the overwhelming strength of his fleet, saw with determination how the warriors of his fleet prepared to face what seemed to be the last resistance in the Aegean Sea. Faced with them, the Greek army was willing to break that power. The Athenian ships, along with those of other Greek polis, remained firm, waiting for a signal to begin what would be the culmination of a war that seemed endless. The Greeks, wiser after their victories in Salamina and Plataea, knew that the moment had arrived. The Persian fleet was a threat that should be eradicated, but it would not be a simple confrontation. Mish not only represented a naval battle, but an opportunity to free the Jonic cities, those that still suffered under the Persian yoke. Cities that they had once rebelled, but in the end they had been subjected again by the relentless Xerxes' army. This was not only a struggle for the sea, it was a struggle for the soul of Greece itself. The Greek fleet moved agility, raffling the waters as a snake stalking its prey. Tigrans looked at the horizon, without fully understanding the magnitude of what was coming. The Greek strategy was not based on brute force, but on cunning. Persian ships, although numerous, did not have the flexibility of the Greek fleet, which maneuvered quickly, surrounding and catching their opponents with a skill that could not be matched. The difference was clear: while the Persians trusted their imposing size and number, the Greeks trusted their unit and strategy. The battle began with a deaf roar, the sound of the waves colliding with the boats of the ships, the crash of the oars with the water, the cries of the men throwing themselves into combat. Each blow against the helmet of a Persian ship was an echo of the resistance of Greek cities, of the struggle for freedom that had started so many lives over the years. The Persians, although strong, began to feel the weight of the pressure, the anxiety of knowing that each Greek maneuver was surrounding them, forcing them to go back. Suddenly, devastation. The Persian ships, one after another, began to sink, their wood shipped by the attacks of the Greeks, their crew falling into the sea or being captured. The wind, which at first seemed to be his ally, now turned against him, pushing the remains of his ships to the coast. Tigrans, seeing how his fleet collapsed, tried to reorganize his men, but chaos had taken over everything. There was no way to save his army. Persian pride, so sure of his power, vanished in the water, while the Greek ships pounced on them with the fury of a storm. And while the Persian fleet was destroyed, the Jonic cities, which they had observed in silence from their coasts, finally rose. The news of the Greek victory in Mycala toured the cities as a fire, awakening in them a hope that had been asleep for years. The Jonic cities, which had been betrayed by Persia again and again, rebelled furiously. There was no fear anymore. There were no more chains. The Greeks, with their victory at sea, not only destroyed a fleet. They broke the chains of the Jonic cities, lit the spark of resistance in the hearts of those who were still under the yoke of Persia. The Jonicos, now free, fought with the Greeks with the strength of a storm, with the passion of those who have been released from endless oppression. The fight continued, unstoppable, but the advantage was already clear. The Persian fleet had been defeated, and with it, Persia's domain over the Aegean had vanished. The Persians, stunned by the magnitude of the defeat, could not understand how they had been defeated by an army that, in comparison, seemed so small. But the Greeks knew that the key to their victory was not in size or force, but in unity, in resistance, and in the struggle for their freedom. The Persian fleet, which once had been the nightmare of the Greek coast, was now just a shadow that faded in the waters of the Aegean. While the waters calmed down, leaving only the remains of a fierce battle, the Greeks looked at the horizon with the certainty that, finally, they had obtained the final victory. The Persian fleet had been destroyed, and the Jonic cities, free again, rose with a renewed force. The war was not yet ended, but with Mycala's victory, Greece's fate had changed forever. The hopes of a future under Persian domain collapsed in the waters of the Aegean Sea, and the dream of Greek freedom, once again, was reborn. The sun was beginning to fall on the horizon, dyed orange and red, as if the sky was burning after the intense fight. The footprints of a fierce war were still fresh, marked on earth, in the sea, and in the hearts of the men who had lived to tell it. The Greek fleets, exhausted but triumphant, watched while the last Persian ships moved away, getting smaller on the horizon, fleeing west, towards their own empire. Persian withdrawal was final. It had been a long, brutal war, a struggle between two worlds that were looked at from extreme opposites of the Aegean, and in the end, the Greek world, together with the sacrifice, courage and the desire for freedom, won victorious. The Greek city-states, who often fought among them, now breathed with a single voice. Athens, Sparta and the other polis that had joined in a survival coalition celebrated a victory that seemed unthinkable. Had defeated the Imp, the greatest river in the known world, one that extended from the limits of India to the coast of Egypt. The first signs of Persian withdrawal extended like a whisper between Greek cities. From the south, on the coast of Mycale, to the north, in the plains of Plataea, the news was watered as gunpowder. The Greeks had won. The Persians, exhausted and defeated, would no longer be an immediate threat. The withdrawal of his army meant much more than a simple military withdrawal. It was a recognition that the Persian dream of conquering Greece had vanished forever. In the battlefields, the figure of Pausanias, the Spartan commander, stood like a lighthouse of victory. The Spartans, known for their relentless discipline and courage, had faced face to face with the Persian army in the Plate, and although the casualties had been many, the victory had been overwhelming. Pausanias, despite the painful loss of men, felt a stillness inside, a feeling of having fulfilled the destiny that his people had entrusted to him. They had defeated the Persians, but what had happened in that field was not only a military victory, but the end of an era of oppression. The Persian withdrawal was not only an act of escape, but the last sigh of an empire that had been thrown west with the certainty that it would crush Greece with its absolute power. But the Persians had found something unexpected, a fierce and determined resistance, a resistance born from the land of Greece itself. And when the waves of the Aegean Sea calmed down, with the last Persian boats already disappearing in the distance, it was clear that the Greek resistance had prevailed. However, victory brought a bitter reflection. The Greeks knew that they could not afford to lose the unity that had led them to this victory. The war had not only strengthened cohesion between them, but had demonstrated what was happening when freedom and homeland joined under the same goal. But now, with the retired Persians, the challenge was not over. The Greek cities, which for so long had been rivals, had to decide whether to continue in this ephemeral unit or if they returned to their old divisions. Meanwhile, Athens, with its intact naval force, looked to the future with a renewed sense of power. Sparta, with his undefeated land army, hoped to recover his position of supremacy in the Peloponnese. And although the Persians retired, the memory of their invasion still burned in the Greek collective memory. The war was over, yes, but the scars of the battle would continue to present. The victory had been great, but the price had been high. In every corner of Greece, from the hills of Attica to the fertile valleys of Argos, men and women looked at the future with hope, knowing that Persian threat was no longer imminent. The Persian Empire, with its vast power and its unstoppable ambition, had been defeated by the courage and sacrifice of Greek men and women. Persian withdrawal not only meant the end of an invasion, but the rebirth of a unified, although ephemeral Greek identity. What had been a survival war, now became a war for legacy and glory. The Greeks knew that, although the war was over, the true battles, which would define their future, were still coming. The last of the Persian ships disappeared in the sea mist, and the last shadow of the Xerxes Empire vanished in the vastness of the ocean. The Greeks, exhausted but victorious, looked at the horizon with a mixture of relief and caution. Peace seemed possible, but so was war. However, for a brief moment, they breathed as a single nation, one voice, and history would remember them for having defended their freedom against the greatest empire that the world had never known. The sun shone strongly on the coast of the Aegean Sea, and the air loaded with salt brought with it a new horizon for the Greek world. The war against Persia had left deep injuries, but had also opened a door towards a future full of opportunities and challenges. Athens, after his victory in Salamina, emerged as the most powerful city-state of Greece, and, like a king crowned in a newly conquered kingdom, his gaze was fixed on the horizon, not only as a defender of his freedom, but as a leader from all over the Greek world. With the withdrawal of the Persians, Athens saw the opportunity to create a network of Greek states united under a common cause. Thus was born the League of Delos, a formal alliance created in 478 BC, whose mission was to protect the Greek cities of future Persian invasions. But what began as a noble intention soon became much more complex and, for many, dangerous. Athens, to the Principe Io willing to lead the defense of unified Greece, he soon showed that he had his own vision of leadership. While the member cities of the League joined for a common purpose, the eye of Athens was put into something bigger, its own hegemony. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens not only provided the military direction, but also assumed control of the League and its treasures. Delos, the island that gave its name to the alliance, became the center of a new system, but in reality, the decision power was in the hands of Athens. Each city-state had to contribute with money or ships to the cause, but the resources that were collected were increasingly addressed to the coffers of the Athens itself. The objective of the League of protecting Greece seemed to have vanished, and instead, Athenian domain over the region was forged. Athens, being the most powerful naval force, turned the League into an extension of its own power. His unstoppable fleet patrolled the waters of the Aegean, protecting his interests, and often demanding taxes to his allies. But, despite the facade of unity and cooperation, the internal tensions of Greece began to emerge as invisible fissures under the surface of the Delos League. The city-states that had originally joined for fear of a Persian invasion were now trapped in a relationship of dependence and submission to Athens. Not all League members were happy with the growing domination of Athens. Some cities, like Sparta, began to see with distrust the power of Athens, which was increasingly beginning to act as an empire, and not as a simple city-state defender of Greek freedom. Sparta, the eternal rival of Athens, was not willing to allow a single city to rule the whole Greek world, and the fragmentation of the Union of Delos seemed inevitable. Within Athens, the euphoria of victory and the expansion of its naval power collided with internal tensions. There were those who opposed the growing concentration of power in the hands of a few, fearing that the freedom of Greek cities would be suffocated under the yoke of Athenian hegemony. The democracy of Athens, which had consolidated in Pericles' times, began to be threatened by the decisions taken by a military and political elite that, although they wanted the good of their city, ignored the voices of the other polis that were part of the League. While the treasures of the League accumulated in the Temple of Athena in the Acropolis, and the Athenian fleets dominated the Aegean Sea, the allied cities began to murmur quietly. Were they really defending Greek freedom, or had they become simple pawns in a bigger game of power and control? Tensions were not only felt in the air, but they began to explode in open conflicts. The speeches became increasingly accusatory in the assemblies, with members of the League demanding more autonomy and less control by Athens. However, Athens, with his army and his imposing fleet, was not willing to give the power he had gained. The promise of a unified Greece under the flag of the League of Delos was slowly crumbled, while the dream of collective freedom was fogged by the struggle for domain. And so, while the League of Delos continued to officially exist as a defensive alliance, in the dark corridors of the city-states, the thoughts and voices of discord began to become stronger. Sparta, with his disciplined land army, remained silent, observing the events with growing restlessness. The city-state that had fought next to Athens to defeat the Persians now saw with distrust the growing power of its rival. The Cold War between the two great Greek powers began to take shape. In Pericles' mind, the dream of an Athenian empire was taking shape, but at a high cost. Athens was trapped between the desire to expand his power and the need to maintain peace among the city-states he had called by his side. Each new naval victory, each new financial contribution only served to increase the tension that threatened to destroy the fragile unity of Greece. The sun kept shining on Delos, but its light no longer seemed so warm. What was once a promise of union had now transformed into a political battlefield, where Greece's future depended not only on swords, but also on words and alliances. How would the history of the League of Delos be written? Would it be a history of unity and victory, or of betrayal and division? The gods watched from Olympus, and the fate of Greece hung from a thread as thin as the wind that blew over the waters of the Aegean. the echo of medical wars still resonated in the hearts of the Greeks. The CIC rises left by the clash with the Persian Empire had not only marked the landscape, but also the souls of those who survived. But the peace that seemed to have won with blood and sacrifice began to crumble like sand between the fingers. Athens and Sparta, the two powers that had joined strength to resist the Persian invader, now looked at themselves as enemies instead of allies. Sparta represented the order, tradition, and terrestrial power, while Athens symbolized the change, art, and naval power. They were opposite in everything, but shared a common desire to be the dominant force of Greece. The tension between both cities was not a secret. Minor disputes and local conflicts multiplied as bones burning under ash, ready to light a fire that would consume everything. The spark finally caught in 431 BC, when Corinth, ally of Sparta, entered into conflict with an allied city of Athens. What began as a regional dispute soon became a total war. The Spartan legions marched, and the Athenian fleet sailed. The earth was trembling under the helmets of the Spartan horses, while the Athenian candles cut the wind. Greece was at war again, but this time not against a foreign enemy, but against herself. The Peloponnese War was brutal. It lasted almost 3 decades and plunged Greece into chaos. The cities burned, the crops were destroyed, and the pest ravaged Athens, snatching life from thousands, including Pericles, their visionary leader. Without him, Athens was wrapped in internal struggles, while Sparta maintained the pressure with his unstoppable terrestrial army. Alliances changed like tides, and betrayal became a currency as common as the iron of the swords. The fields were stained with blood, and the cities emptied. The ideals of democracy that Athens had defended began to crumble under the weight of despair and hunger. For its part, Sparta, rigid and militaristic, also paid a high price. His closed system, designed to create warriors and non-diplomats, proved to be unable to hold an empire. The Spartans could conquer, but they didn't know how to govern. The war left Greece exhausted. When Athens finally surrendered in 404 BC, it was no longer the proud city that had defeated the Persians in Marathon and Salamina. Its fleet was destroyed, its demolished walls, and its dismantled empire. Sparta, although victorious, did not leave unharmed. His reputation as defender of Greek freedom was tarnished by his role as a conqueror. The other polis, exhausted and fragmented, were vulnerable to new external threats. The dream of a united Greece, which was born in the battles against Persia, broke into 1,000 pieces. The Peloponnese Wars not only destroyed cities and lives, but also buried the hope of a shared future. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta left scars so deep that they never healed completely. The Greeks had proven to be able to resist a foreign empire, but were unable to resist themselves. As the ashes of the war settled, the survivors looked at the horizon with fear. The void left by the powers in decline attracted new shadows. Macedonia, under the eyes of a young man named Philip, began to strengthen himself in the north. Meanwhile, the Greeks, divided and exhausted, were still looking for answers in the ruins of their cities and in the words of their oracles. But the prophecies were dark, and peace seemed a distant dream. The greatness of the Persian Empire, once immense and feared, began to crack from within. The stones that had built their vast domain began to stagger under the weight of distrust, corruption, and the thirst for power. The Persian kings who followed Georges I did not inherit their strength or their vision. In luck to govern firmly, they were dragged by palatial intrigues and rebellions that consumed the heart of the empire. The satraps, which were once the pillars of the Persian administration, became gentlemen of small fortunes, governing their provinces as personal kingdoms. The tensions between them and the central throne intensified, and the revolts sprouted like weeds in spring. The borders of the empire, so vast that they hugged from Egypt to India, were difficult to maintain. The armies, worn and poorly directed, began to falter. What had been a symbol of order and power was now seen as a decomposition structure. While the chaos grew inside Persia, the shadows on the horizon became longer. To the north, Macedonia, a nation considered less by the Persians, began to strengthen under the leadership of Philip II. His son, Alejandro, had grown up listening to stories about Marathon battles, Thermopylae, and Salamina. I did not see them as heroic stories of Greek resistance, but as the first chapter of an unfinished story. For him, Persia was not invincible, it was a giant tired, vulnerable and ready to fall. In 336 BC, Alexander the Great mounted to the throne of Macedonia after his father's murder. Young, charismatic and ambitious, did not waste time to carry out his plans. His army, small but disciplined, was different from everything Persia had faced before. He did not fight with the bureaucratic slowness of an empire, but with the speed and precision of a predator. While Persia was lost in internal conspiracies, Alejandro crossed the Hellespont with the determination to change the course of history. The first big test was the Battle of Granico in 334 BC. The Persians, confident in their number, underestimated Alejandro's tactical ability. The defeat was fast and humiliating. But the worst was to come. In the Battle of Issos, Dario III, the last great Persian king, personally led his army. The story seemed to repeat. As Syrup before him, Dario saw how his power crumbled before a smaller but more determined enemy. Alejandro crushed the Persian army and forced Dario to flee, leaving behind not only his treasure but also his family. The fall of Persia was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. Alejandro advanced mercilessly, taking cities and destroying resistance in his path. In 331 BC, in the Battle of Gaugamela, the fate of the empire was sealed. Dario fled once again, but this time he did not survive. He was killed by his own men, who saw in Alejandro a new ruler to serve. The greatness of Persia was reduced to ashes. The doors of Persepolis, the jewel of the empire, opened for Alejandro. In a symbolic and ruthless act, the palaces burned as revenge for the destruction of Athens during the Medical Wars. The flames that devoured Persepolis marked the end of an era. What had begun as a kingdom founded by Ciro el Grande ended as a trophy in the hands of a young conqueror. But the fall of the Persian Empire was not just a change of rulers. It was the end of one world and the birth of another. Alejandro not only destroyed Persia, he also absorbed it. He adopted his customs, dressed his clothes and married Persian princesses. His ambition was not to erase Persian culture, but mix it with the Greek to create something new, a universal empire. However, Alejandro's triumph also sowed the seeds of future struggles. His empire, although vast, was unstable. His premature death left a vacuum that quickly filled with wars among his generals, known as the Diadocos. Persia, which had been a unity symbol, was divided between fragmented kingdoms. Despite its fall, the Persian legacy did not disappear. His art, architecture, and administrative systems continued to influence later civilizations. But for those who walked among the ruins of Persepolis, the end of the empire was a reminder that even the greatest can fall. The stones that had witnessed the glory of Ciro and Dario now lay in silence, witnesses of a story that would never be repeated. Meanwhile, in the hearts of those who lived under Persian power, there was a persistent question: had it been the empire victim of their own greatness? The echoes of that question continued to resonate in the mountains and the deserts they once called home. And somewhere, among the ashes of what was, the dreams of a resurgence still burned silently. Amid the heat of medical wars, when Greece's survival pending a thread, figures arose whose courage and cunning mold history. Their names were not mere echoes in memory, they were screams of resistance engraved in stone and fire. Leonidas, Themistocles, and Miltiades were not just men. Was Rum symbols of an impossible challenge against the most feared power of the ancient world. Leonidas, king of Sparta, became the incarnation of unwavering courage. In the narrow steppe of the Thermopylas, where the mountains rose as natural walls and the sea whispered warnings, Leonidas and its 300 Spartans prepared for the inevitable. They knew that death was waiting for them, but they also knew that Greece's freedom depended on their sacrifice. The night before the battle, when the torches projected disturbing shadows, a Persian messenger arrived with an offer: surrender and living. Leonidas did not hesitate. His response, dry and fierce, was recorded in eternity: Molen Labe, come and take it. At dawn, when the roar of the Persians filled the valley, Leonidas led his men with the certainty of a sealed destination. They resisted waves after waves, knocking down enemies until their swords broke. In the end, surrounded and exhausted, they fought with their naked hands. When the dust settled, the Spartans lay dead, but their sacrifice had lit a flame that would never go out. Themistocles, on the other hand, did not depend on physical force, but on his sharp mind. It was a strategist whose vision saved Greece at the darkest moment. After the fall of Athens, when the flames consumed the empty city, Themistocles gathered the Greek fleet in Salamina. He knew they could not defeat the Persians on land, but in the narrow sea, where the numerical superiority of syllables would become a hindrance, Greece had a chance. He cheated the enemy by sending a false message, attracting the Persian fleet to the strait. In the early morning, while the fog rose, the Greek ships emerged as relentless shadows. The waters were filled with shouts and shipyard. The Persians, trapped, were shattered one by one. Themistocles had shown that cunning could defeat the brute force. When the sun set, the sea was dyed red and the Persian pride had been crushed. Milesiades, the marathon hero, showed that courage could convert hopelessness into victory. Faced with an overwhelming Persian army, the Athenians were in numerical inferiority and without reinforcements. But Milesiades did not allow fear to dominate. He devised a bold tactic. Instead of forming a defensive line, he ordered a frontal attack. Their strategy surprised the Persians, who were pushed into the sea in a bloody chaos. When the battle ended, the Athenians had achieved the unthinkable. The echo of his victory was not only heard in Greece, but also reached Persia, where Dario swore revenge. But for the Greeks, Marathon was more than a battle won. It was the proof that freedom could defend against all prognosis. The legacy of these men was not just a military. His courage inspired generations, remembering that resistance to oppression is possible, even when the enemy seems invincible. Leonidas taught that the sacrifice can be the spark that turns on revolutions. Themistocles showed that strategic intelligence can change the course of history. Milesiades proved that audacity can defeat numerical superiority. Their names were not buried in forgotten tombs. They lived in songs, stories, and monuments. The Greeks, even after the wars, returned again and again to their stories to remember who they were and why they fought. But their legacies do not belong only to Greece. Centuries later, when new generations faced tyrannies and challenges, they found inspiration in the decisions that these leaders took under the pressure of the war. While the ruins of the Thermopylas and Marathon erode slowly, the spirit of Leonidas, Themistocles, and Milesiades is still alive. Their courage, cunning, and determination are still headlights in a world where freedom threats never disappear completely. And so, the story continues, always looking back, looking in these heroes' answers to face the challenges of the present. From the vast plains of Persia, where the palaces of Susa and Persepolis shone like jewels in the middle of the desert, the history of medical wars acquires a different nuance. For the Persian Empire, governed by Dario I and then by his son Gergis I, the conflict was not simply an invasion, but a company to restore order and reaffirm his authority over territories that challenged the greatness of his power. The Persian Empire was not just a nation, it was an immense fabric of interlaced peoples and cultures under a divine ruler. From the mountains of the Caucasus to the shores of the Indo, Persia looked itself as the guardian of civilization, while Greek city-states were seen as small and disorderly, a collection of rebels unable to understand the power of an authority centralized. For Persia, submitting the Greeks was not an act of free aggression, but the natural extension of their divine duty, bringing harmony to the world. When the news of the Ionic revuelta reached Dario's ears, there was no surprise, but outraged. Those little Greek settlements in Asia Minor, who had prospered under Persian protection, had dared to rise in rebellion. Worse, Athens and Eretria, two cities on the other side of the Aegean Sea, had sent ships and men to feed the fire of the insurrection. From the Persian perspective, this was not a local challenge, it was an affront against the dignity of the great king, a betrayal that should be punished to preserve the stability of the empire. Persian stories, preserved in cuneiform inscriptions and inherited records, show Dario as a man of vision and patience, but also as a ruler who did not tolerate insubordination. His decision to launch a campaign against Greece was seen as an act of justice, not conquest. For the Persians, each lifted spear and each built ship were part of a divine mandate granted by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrismo, who had entrusted to the kings Aquamenides the task of maintaining order in front of chaos. When Dario died and Gergis assumed the throne, the conflict was no longer just a political issue. He had acquired a personal nuance. Xerxes not only inherited the crown, but also the debt of revenge against Athens. His determination of invading Greece was molded by a family honor and a desire to restore the prestige lost in Marathon. For Persia, the invasion was not seen as an aggression, but as a restoration of universal harmony, a necessary rebalancing of the cosmos. Persian preparations reflected that vision of greatness. The bridges on the Hellespont and the channels excavated on Mount Athos were not only engineering feats, they were symbols of divine will manifesting through human power. The men who formed the Persian ranks were not just soldiers, they were faithful subjects that represented the diversity of the empire: Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydia, and Scythians, united under a common purpose. From the Persian gaze, the Greek resistance was seen as obstinacy and ignorance. The Persians could not understand how divided peoples, without a central king, could face a unified army. The sacrifice of Leonidas in the Thermopylae was registered, but not as heroism, but as stubbornness. For Persia, Greek courage seemed more desperately than a calculated tactic. Even the defeat in Salamina was not interpreted as the end of the campaign, but as a temporary setback. Xerxes returned to Asia, leaving Mardonio with the control of forces in Greece, confident that the Greek resistance would fall apart alone. But the collapse in the Plate and Mycah denied that expectation. For the Persians, these defeats were not seen as a collapse of their power, but as a reminder that even the most vast empires are not exempt from challenges. However, in the heart of Persia, the news of failure generated uncomfortable silences. The inscriptions in Persepolis that celebrated the glory of the empire were left without words to describe the defeats. There were no detailed records of the failures in Greece, instead, the emphasis remained in the internal victories and the stability of the empire. The Persian narrative was not built around failure, but around each work created after the conflict seemed to beat to the rhythm of the victories and defeats, carrying raw emotions and symbols that even move us today. Greek tragedies captured the torn soul of those years. Aeschylus, one of the great playwrights of Athens, not only fought in Marathon, but also expressed the experience in his works. In The Persians, he did not celebrate the Greek victory as a glorification, but showed the tragedy from the point of view of the defeated enemy. He presented the Persians as humans broken by pride and ambition, trapped in their destiny. The shadow of Xerxes, portrayed as an expired and repentant man, brought tears even to the victors. It was a warning about arrogance and the price of excess confidence. In the friezes of the part and in the murals of forgotten temples, the artists carved stories in stone and marble. The battle between Greeks and Persians became mythological metaphors. In the frieze of the part, the Amazons fight against the Athenians as a symbolic representation of the barbarians facing the civilized ones. The message was clear: Athens had protected humanity against chaos. Each sculpted figure, each tense muscle, and each lifted spear reflect the heroism that the Greeks wanted to perpetuate forever. But there were also injuries in art. The destroyed statues and the temples razed during the Persian invasion of Athens were not forgotten. Reconstruction became an act of cultural resistance. The Acropolis, with its renewed majesty, rose as a visual reminder that the Greek spirit had not been bent. The scars in the stone were deliberately left as part of the story. The artists did not erase the signs of destruction, they were integrated so that future generations did not forget the fragility of peace. Epic poetry also found in the medical wars a fertile land. Poets like CEO Simonides composed elegies in honor of the fallen, recording names in collective memory. In verses that spoke of courage and sacrifice, Simonides immortalized the Spartans who died in the Thermopylae. "Traveler, go and tell Sparta that we lie here, obeying his laws," said his famous epitaph, an echo of courage that is still repeated. These poems were not only tributes, but emotional anchors that kept the image of the sacrifice alive. Medical wars not only inspired pride, but also uncomfortable questions. Euripides, in his work Last Trianas, used the ruins of Troy as a mirror of what could happen to Greece if he gave up arrogance. Although the work does not directly mention the conflict with Persia, its echoes resonate in each scene of pain and loss. Athens, remembering its own vulnerability during the invasion, found in these tragedies a warning of the ephemeral power. Even in everyday objects, such as painted ceramics, conflict stories persisted. Varsiges decorated with hoplites marching in formation or ships fighting in the Salamina Strait served to remind citizens that their freedom had been bought with blood. The ceremonial vessels, often used in festivals and banquets, said that these stories were told again and again, feeding the civic pride of each generation. The Persians, meanwhile, left their own artistic brand of the conflict. In Persepolis, carved reliefs showed endless ranks of submitted peoples carrying taxes to the great king. Although they did not directly represent the defeat suffered in Greece, these images transmitted the permanence of their power. Persian art spoke of unity and greatness, ignoring the shadows of humiliation in the West. For the Persians, the visual narrative reaffirmed its divine right to govern, even when reality had begun to fracture. The memory of medical wars did not end in marble or ancient verses. It became the basis of Western identity, a story of freedom against oppression. However, that freedom was also a fragile illusion. Greek literature and art remembered the danger of disunity, but history would soon demonstrate that lessons are not always learned in time. In the midst of the shadows projected by the statues and the words sculpted in stone, an uncertain future was gestured that no one was prepared to face. When war looms like a storm about cities, human hearts seek answers in heaven. In medical wars, religion was not only a comfort, but a guide and a weapon. The Greeks did not take a step without consulting their gods. Each military decision was dyed of mysticism, each battle was a dance between the mortal and the divine. Oracles, sacrifices and omen were more than rituals, they were messages of destiny, warnings, and promises that could change the course of events. In Delphi, the temple of Apollo vibrated with the smoke of the incense and the whispers of the faithful. There, the Pisha, the priestess who spoke in the name of the god, sat on the sacred tripod and entered trance. His voice, fragmented as the echo of a lightning, issued prophecies that could bring hope or terror. When the Athenians consulted the oracle before the Persian invasion, the answer was disturbing. Before Marathon, the omens were favorable, filling the courage hoplites while carrying the enemy. However, not all divine messages were clear. In the Thermopylas, Leonidas consulted the gods, but the signs were gloomy. He knew that death was waiting for him. Even so, he decided to face his destiny. His sacrifice resonated as an almost religious act, a tribute to the gods of war and homeland. The Greeks saw him as a hero touched by the hand of the gods, a man who had transcended his humanity to enter the legend. The gods not only influenced the hearts of the warriors, but also in the heavens and seas. The Persians learned this lesson in the Hellesponto, when a storm destroyed part of its fleet. Serges, enraged, ordered the sea as punishment, a desperate act to control what was beyond human power. But for the Greeks, the storm was a sign of Zeus, a reminder that Persian pride would be punished. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic war, was the protector of Athens. His presence was felt in the walls of the city and in the minds of the generals. Its temple, the Part, became a symbol of divine resistance. In each shield, unreleased, the warriors were looking for their favor. In Sparta, the sacrifices were even more bloody. Ars, the god of war, demanded blood taxes, and the Spartans did not hesitate to give it to him. His strong discipline and his contempt for death were seen as a reflection of the divine will. But the gods could also sow fear. Artemisa, the hunter goddess, was invoked by the Persians before the Battle of Salamina. However, when the Persian fleet was destroyed, the Greeks interpreted him as a rejection of the goddess towards her enemies. The Persians, despite their greatness, were seen as wicked, unable to understand the balance between force and reverence. The fear of divine anger was so entrenched that, even after the victories, the Greeks performed rituals to appease the gods. In Plataea, after the last great battle, the victors offered sacrifices in thanks, but also to clean the spilled blood. The bodies were buried carefully, and the tombs became sacred places. For the Greeks, the fallen were not just dead, they were heroes guided by the gods towards eternity. In art and poetry, medical wars were counted as an epic story, where the gods moved the threads of destiny. The friezes of the Part showed Athena protecting their people, while the tragedies represented the Persians as warnings of what happens when the divine order is challenged. The conflict was more than a fight between men, it was a battle for the very soul of humanity. While the flames of the sacrifices rose and the voices of the priests recited prayers, the warriors closed their eyes and trusted that they were not alone. They believed that the gods walked between them, guiding their hands and protecting their backs. But they also knew that the fury of the gods could fall at any time, reminding them that even the victors are at the mercy of destiny. When the war roar broke the calm of the ancient world, strategy and technology were the invisible forces that decided the fate of thousands of men. In medical wars, the Persians and the Greeks faced not only with swords and spears, but also with cunning minds and a strong will to get victorious. The battle was not only fought in the field, but in the hearts and minds of the commanders, who knew that a single decision could change the course of history. The Persians, under the command of kings like Dario I and Geris I, brought with him a military machinery that seemed invincible. His army was a colossus composed of thousands of men, elite units, and an impressive logistics force that exceeded anything seen in ancient Greece. The Persian infantry, known for its diversity, was formed by troops of different ethnic groups and cultures, which gave it a unique ability to adapt to different lands and circumstances. Persian archers, which was their most powerful unit, dominated the battlefield. They used the long arch, capable of shooting arrows at large distances, which allowed them to overflow their enemies from afar, weakening the enemy lines before they could even approach. In addition, the Persian army had a feared cavalry throughout Asia. Persian riders moved as shadows, flanking and attacking quickly. The combination of infantry and cavalry gave the Persians a great mobility, an army that seemed to never get tired, capable of throwing attacks on multiple fronts, even in the sea with its powerful fleet. Persian ships, triremes, were large and powerful, and their ability to transport troops was a crucial factor in invasions, which allowed the Persians to invade distant lands without geography being able to stop them. However, the numerical advantage and diversity of the Persians were not enough to guarantee victory. The Greeks, although much smaller in number, had a military quality that the Persians could not match. Ancient Greece, although fragmented in small independent polis, had developed a unique approach to war, the phalanx. This heavy infantry formation, where the soldiers aligned shoulder to shoulder, covering each other, created an impenetrable wall of spears and shields. Each hopliter, as the Greek warriors were known, were trained to fight in this formation, trusting the group's cohesion to defeat the enemy. Unlike the Persians, who depended more on mobility, the Greeks trusted the solidity and resistance of their infantry, which could resist prolonged attacks and organize devastating counterattacks. The design of weapons also reflected these differences. The Greeks, armed mainly with the spear and short sword, were expert fighters in melee combat, trained to close the distance with the enemy and take advantage of the brutality of the fight at a short distance. In contrast, the Persians trusted the long distances, with archers that kept the enemy at bay before it could approach. However, in a direct confrontation, the Greeks had the advantage. The short sword and the round shield, more manageable, allowed greater agility in nearby fighting, while the Persians, with their archers' strategy, needed time and space to display their artillery. The Marathon Battle, one of the most emblematic clashes of medieval wars, showed how Greek tactics could overcome the brute force of the Persian army. The Athenians, under the direction of Miltiades, managed to deceive the Persians, making them believe that they were at a disadvantage, only to launch a surprise attack on their flanks, where the Persians were not prepared. It was a demonstration of strategic cunning, a reminder that intellect and speed could overcome numerical superiority. The use of the phalanx, together with the courage of the hopliters, allowed the Greeks to defeat a much larger army, winning the battle and demonstrating to the world that the force does not always beat the ingenuity. In the sea, technology and tactics also made a difference. The Battle of Salamina, one of the most crucial victories for the Greeks, was an example of how tactics and land could neutralize numerical superiority. Persian triremes, although larger and with more capacity to transport troops, were less maneuverable than Greek ships, which were lighter and faster. Themistocles, the Athenian leader, used the Salamina Strait in his favor, guiding Persian ships towards a trap. In a limited space, the Persians could not use their superior force in their favor, and the Greeks, with their superior maneuverability, defeated the Persian fleet, sinking many of their ships and achieving a decisive victory. The conflict also showed how morality and value played a fundamental role in the fight. The Persians, although powerful and well-organized, often lacked internal cohesion that unified the Greeks in their struggle for freedom and survival. While the Greeks, despite their numerical disadvantage, fought with a fervor that the Persians could not understand. The defense of the country, the love for their lands and their gods, made each Greek soldier an unstoppable warrior, willing to give everything for his city and his people. The differences between the armies of Persia and Greece were not only issues of size and weapons, but also of spirit and strategy. While the Persians trusted their vast power and resources, the Greeks showed that the heart and mind could be much more powerful weapons than any army. War is not just a battlefield, it is also an economic sand, where resources, both human and material, are so essential like swords and shields. During the medical wars, both the Persians and the Greeks quickly understood that success not only depended on the military force, but also on their ability to sustain the long and exhausting campaigns. The cost of war, both in terms of resources and human lives, was devastating for both sides, but ultimately, the Greeks, with their limited means, demonstrated that the will and strategy could overcome economic obstacles. The Persians, as a vast and extended empire, had the advantage of the wealth of an entire continent. From the gold and silver of Lydia to the vast agricultural lands of Asia Minor, the Persian Empire had resources that seemed infinite. However, this wealth also brought with it a challenge: how to manage and mobilize that wealth effectively to hold their campaigns. The cost of Greece's invasion was monumental. The construction of floating bridges on the Hellespont, the mobilization of a mass fleet and the recruitment of troops from all parts of the empire were colossal tasks that required extraordinary resources. The Persians not only depended on gold and silver, but also on human labor, forcing many peoples undergoing men, food and materials for war. However, the problem of Persians was not only economic, but also logistics. As his army advanced, the difficulties of supplying troops on foreign lands became overwhelming. The long supply chain they needed to maintain such a vast army through thousands of kilometers of inhospitable territory was one of the greatest obstacles. The dependence of the natural and human resources of the conquered peoples meant that, as they advanced, local resistance did so. The Greek peoples, even those of Asia Minor, were determined to prevent the exploitation of their lands, which added pressure to the already difficult situation of the Persians. And, although they had the ability to mobilize thousands of men, the human cost of long marches and constant battles was also significant. In the case of the Greeks, war was not only a military effort, but also a struggle for its economic and political survival. Athens, in particular, was forced to make mass sacrifices to finance war. The Athenian polis resorted to its silver reserves, specifically those obtained from the Laurian mines, to finance their fleet. Themistocles, the cunning Athenian strategist, understood the importance of having a fleet capable of facing the Persians in the sea, and did not hesitate to use the richness obtained from the mines to build ships and finance the soldiers. But as in the case of the Persians, the human cost was equally high. Greek cities needed to gather all men capable of fighting, leaving behind land and families. The Greek war economy not only depended on money and resources, but also on the exploitation of labor. While the soldiers fought on the front, women, elders, and children assumed work on land and cities, helping to maintain food production and other essential resources. The Greek polis also experienced great social pressure. The need to keep troops well fed and equipped meant that cities had to organize with unprecedented efficiency. But this effort also brought internal tensions. The disputes on the resources and the distribution of the riches obtained from the victories were common. Although the unit was essential to resist Persian invasion, internal conflicts between Greek states did not disappear, and war was not only fought in the battlefields, but also in decisions about who would receive which part of the resources. As the war progressed, the exploitation of human resources became a crucial element. The Greeks, being surrounded by an empire as vast as Persian, not only fought against the Persian army, but also against the pressures of slavery, forced recruitment, and devastating human losses. In each battle, men fell, but the need to continue fighting did not stop. As the war extended, so did human sacrifice. Each victory or defeat brought a price, and that price was a life. Greek cities, despite their efforts, were overwhelmed by economic pressure, and the need to deal with Persian invasion, often a high cost in families and society itself, was charged. In this sense, war was a fight not only for the control of the earth, but for the possibility of survival, of continuing to exist as independent polis, capable it is to sustain their own economies and societies. Each victory, each defeat, not only meant the advance or fall of an empire, but also the fate of the people fighting in them, whose hope and sacrifice depended on an uncertain future. And although the richness of Persia seemed unstoppable, the determination of the small Greek cities, united in their struggle for freedom, turned out to be the greatest richness of all. In ancient Greece, freedom was not only a political concept, but a deep essence that defined the life of its citizens, the structure of its city-states, and the struggle for survival against invading empires. This concept of freedom was articulated mainly in the contrast between democracy and tyranny, two systems that represented opposite poles, not only in terms of government, but in the very nature of human life. In Athens, the cradle of democracy, freedom was synonymous with the citizens' ability to actively participate in the decisions that ruled their city. Athenian democracy, although not perfect or inclusive in its entirety, allowed its citizens, free and half-class men, to have a voice in state affairs. This model of freedom was based on the idea that each individual should be able to govern and be governed, a revolutionary notion in their time. Citizens could not only vote, but also to perform roles in public administration, present laws, and even be part of courts. This active and direct participation in public life gave them a sense of control over their destiny and that of their polis. Freedom not only meant the absence of oppression, but the possibility of shaping the future through collective action. However, for the Greeks, freedom was not only measured by political participation, but also by the ability to live without the yoke of tyranny. Tyranny, in the Greek conception, was the antithesis of freedom, a form of government that represented the absolute control of a single individual about the lives of others. The tyrants, far from being simple dictators, were perceived as those who used power for their own benefit, stripping the citizens of their voice and submitting them to their will. For Athenians and other Greek polis, tyranny was not only a political threat, but a threat to the essence of what was human being. The tyrant represented the corruption of the human soul, which passed from freedom to slavery not only of body, but of mind. Tyranny looked like an evil to eradicate, something that not only overshadowed public life, but corrupted the morality and justice of the community. This contrast between democracy and tyranny reached its peak in medieval wars, where Greek cities were pushed to fight not only for their physical survival, but for the preservation of their way of life. For the Greeks, Persian invasion was not just a military threat, it was a struggle for freedom itself. Over the centuries, the Persians had established a vast empire in which tyranny was the norm, where the absolute power of a monarch, such as Dario I and his son Xerxes, defined the lives of millions of people. This system of government, focused on the figure of the king, violently contrasted with the Greek vision of a government based on the will of the people, a polis in which the active participation of citizens was essential for the preservation of freedom. When the Greeks faced the Persians, they not only fought for the territory, but for the possibility of continuing to exist as a free culture. On the battlefield, the fight was not only for material victory, but for the conservation of that space where man could decide his destiny. The resistance in the Thermopylas, the victory in Marathon, and the cunning of Thebes in Salamina were much more than military victories, they represented the reaffirmation of the human value of freedom against the oppression of an empire that did not know popular participation and shared justice. The Greek narrative about freedom not only influenced its form of government, but also penetrated its art, its literature, and philosophy. The tragedy, as in the works of Sophocles and Aeschylus, portrayed the internal struggle between destiny and freedom, between divine control and human autonomy. The tragic heroes, such as Oedipus or Prometheus, were figures that faced the tyranny of fate, fighting for their freedom, although they were often condemned by it. These stories reflected a fundamental belief in the value of human freedom, not as a utopian perfection, but as a constant struggle, often lost, but always worthy of being freed. The contrast between democracy and tyranny also extended to the way the Greeks saw foreigners. For them, the Persians not only represented a military threat, but a threat to their way of life. Persian invasion was not just a territorial conflict, it was a confrontation between two worlds, one based on active participation and free will, and another based on centralized and absolute control. This conception of freedom, deeply rooted in the Greek culture, not only influenced his response to the Persian invasion, but also lasting throughout history, becoming one of the most durable legacies of Western civilization. Greek freedom was not an abstract freedom, but a lived freedom, fought, defended by cape and sword. It was the possibility of being part of a community that decided its own destiny. In this sense, the meaning of freedom for the Greeks was inseparable from the notion of active citizenship, of participation in public life. It was not enough to be free, you had to be able to exercise that freedom, to influence the decisions that affected the polis. Freedom, for the Greeks, was not a given gift, but a constant conquest, a struggle that endured over time and that, in its maximum splendor, made human life have a transcendental meaning. In the heart of the vast land that extended from the Iranian plateaus to the banks of the Nile and the Aegean, the Persian Empire was erected as a colossus, an amalgam of different peoples, cultures, and languages, governed by an absolute monarch. Ciro el Grande, Dario I and later Xerxes, were not simply leaders, they were living divinities, responsible not only for security, but the destiny of millions. The administration of the Persian Empire was based on a centralized organization, on which power concentrated on the king's hands, but in turn, this structure was responsible for allowing peoples under their domain to enjoy relative autonomy. In this vision, the empire did not impose a cultural homogenization, but allowed the conquered nations to maintain their traditions and government systems in exchange for tribute and loyalty. This apparent political tolerance was in an acute contrast with the Greek ideals, whose fervor for individual freedom and the autarky of city-states made them immensely jealous of any form of external domination. The Persian system was vast, of a magnitude such that neither the wisest man could cover it completely. From the satrapia that ruled entire provinces, to the imposing roads that linked the corners of the empire, the Persian administration was designed to maintain order, stability and above all, the reverence to the king, whom the King of Kings was considered the King of Kings. There was no open discussion, nor a forum in which the population could question the decisions of the monarch. In this system, laws emanated directly from the throne, unwavering, imposed without remorse. Unlike this absolute power, Greek city-states had created a political culture where active participation was the cornerstone of its existence. In Athens, democracy flourished, although only for male, free and native citizens. The idea of freedom, of the voice of the people, was based on the political system that allowed the Athenians to make decisions together, in the assembly, where the issues of the day were discussed. For the Greeks, the idea of being governed by a single man, an absolute monarch as in Persia, was abominable. Freedom was not only the right to live without oppression, but the right to participate actively in the fate of the city. The idea that a single human being could concentrate all the power over an entire empire, with the ability to decide the life and death of miles, collided directly with the democratic values that the Greeks deeply appreciated. What the Persians could not understand, and what was disconcerting for many of them, was the insistence of the Greeks to maintain an independence that often seemed to make no sense from an imperial perspective. In Persia, loyalties were bought with taxes and secured through a hierarchy of satrapia, governors who were under the direct supervision of the king, but enjoyed great autonomy in their territories. This form of government worked efficiently in such a vast empire, but in the small Greek city-states, where the well-being of the community depended on the active participation of all its members, the idea of a centralized government that imposed decisions from above was seen as a direct threat to freedom and social order. The Persians, being a multinational empire, also tried to govern with relative religious and cultural tolerance, allowing the conquered peoples to maintain their beliefs and customs, provided that they paid taxes and not challenged the king's authority. The Greeks, on the other hand, although equally diverse, struggled to maintain their civic traditions, to preserve their way of organizing political, social, and economic life. In this context, Persian invasion was not only a military threat, but a cultural threat. It was not just a matter of battles and victories in the field of war, but a struggle for control over the identity of the Greeks. For them, allowing a foreign king, such as Dario or Xerxes, to put his eyes on his lands, was more than a physical invasion, it was an invasion of his values, his lifestyle. Through the Persian look, the Greeks were seen as rebels, as people unable to recognize the natural order of the world. The Persians saw their empire as a structure in which each people had their place, under the sovereignty of the king, and this order should be respected. For them, the fragmentation of the Greek polis and the insurrection against Persian authority represented a threat to global stability. However, for the Greeks, resistance to this authority represented the act of preserving something bigger than a simple territorial struggle. It represented the defense of its freedom against a system that sought to impose absolute control. The war between Persians and Greeks was not only a battle for land, but for the fundamental values of each civilization. The Persian administration, with its centralization and hierarchy, contrasted with the direct democracy of the Greek polis, where the voice of each free citizen had weight in decision-making. It was a war between two worlds, between two ways of conceiving power and freedom, which would define not only the future of Greece, but also the course of the history of the ancient world. The Greeks, in their resistance, not only fought against the power of Persia, but against the very idea of being dominated by a system that denied them the right to decide their destiny. In this way, medical wars were not only a series of military clashes, but an ideological war, a war in which the ideals of freedom, democracy, and self-determination faced the absolute power of an empire that aspired to total control over their subjects. Ultimately, although the Persian Empire could have won battles, the Greek ideals prevailed, leaving an indelible mark on the history of human thought. The echo of medical wars resonates throughout history, not only as a series of decisive battles, but as a turning point that marked the struggle for freedom against the absolute power of an expansionist empire. In the vast plot of world history, this conflict stands out for its intensity, but also for the lessons that it left on resistance, cultural identity, and the impact of ideals on military actions. While it is impossible to make an exact comparison with other conflicts, medical wars have parallels with other key moments in history, where survival and ideals clash violently. First, we must consider the war that faced the Greeks with the Persians as a reflection of the struggle between individualism and the centralization of power. Something similar is observed in the conflict between Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars, in which the two powers fought for the control of the Mediterranean. Like Persia, Carthage represented an empire with a centralized power system, and Rome, with its growing republic, personified the struggle for autonomy and expansion based on a vision of freedom and citizenship. In both wars, the subjugated peoples, the peoples who rebelled or aligned with one of the two powers, played a crucial role, like the Greek polis that resisted Persia, fighting not only for their survival, but for their own ideal. The conflict between Rome and Carthage has a resonance similar to medical wars, in terms of the fight between two models of government. While the Romans believed in the ability of the people to influence the destiny of the republic, the Carthaginians, as well as the Persians, maintained a more hierarchical and monarchical structure. In Punic Wars, as in medical wars, a battle for the survival of a government system against another was fought, and victory was not only military, but ideological. The medical wars, therefore, represent a broader paradigm in the history of the great clashes for autonomy, order, and the way in which people see themselves within their political structures. A conflict of similar characteristics, but with different nuances, occurred in the struggle between the Romans and the Gauls, in which the Roman Empire faced dispersed but fiercely independent tribes. Like the Greeks, the Gauls valued freedom and autonomy in your way of life. The Roman invasion and the subsequent conquest of the Gaul, they were freer and more autonomous, but also more vulnerable to the unification of a larger and more powerful empire. If we look at the East, the struggle of the Greeks against Persia can also be compared to the confrontation of the peoples of India against the invading empires such as those carried out by Alexander the Great and the Mongols. In both cases, the invasion of great external power caused a response of fierce resistance by peoples that sought to protect their cultural and political autonomy. While the response of the Greeks was an active and military resistance, the history of India showed different forms of resistance, from open rejection to strategic cooperation. However, both stories are a testimony of human desire for the preservation of identity and independence, facing the threat of losing everything under the sword of imperial power. Closer over time, we can think of colonial wars, especially those waged in America and Africa, where the largest nations in Europe, driven by the imperialist eagerness, tried to conquer territories in search of resources, labor, and territorial expansion. Like Persia with the Greeks, the colonial powers imposed a system of military, economic, and cultural control, which was resisted by the indigenous peoples who fought for their freedom, for preserving their traditions, languages, and customs. This resistance was not only on the battlefield, but also in the cultural and spiritual planes, a struggle that we can also see reflected in the dynamics between the Greeks and the Persians. What makes the difference, however, in medical wars is the resounding victory of the Greeks, a small set of polis, in front of one of the great powers of the ancient world. This victory not only had an impact on the policy and geography of the moment, but deeply molded European and Western identity, establishing a precedent for future nation-state and the concept of democracy. While other conflicts, such as Punic Wars or colonial wars, also altered the course of history, medical wars, especially Greek victory, represents the triumph of resistance against an authoritarian power, a power that seeks to standardize and master, about autonomy and freedom. In all these cases, war and resistance were not only physical. They were ultimately a matter of values. The Greeks fought to maintain their lifestyle, their vision of the world, in opposition to a centralized and authoritarian power. In the history of colonized peoples, resistance was also a battle to preserve identity in front of a colonizing empire. Somehow, medical wars are not only an isolated chapter of ancient history, but an integral part of the continuous story of humanity, of the constant struggle between the individual and power, between the ideals of freedom and the systems that seek to submit them. The medical wars, like other conflicts throughout history, offer lessons that still resonate in the present, reminding us that the battles freed are not only by territories, but also for values, cultures, and ideals. The medical wars, although marked by a fierce military confrontation, were not only a conflict of swords and shields. They were also a fertile field for the birth of myths, legends, and narratives that intertwined with historical facts, creating an amalgam of truth and fantasy that endured in collective memory. In ancient chronicles, the struggle between the Greeks and the Persians is not only narrated as a battle for political survival, but as a series of supernatural events where the gods, oracles, and destinations of men intersect in an inseparable way. The stories of heroes such as Leonidas, Miltiades, and Themistocles, although immortalized for their value in the battles of the Thermopyles and Marathon, were also molded by the hand of the poets and playwrights who, in their works, saw more than simple military leaders, that they saw as half-shiates, as instruments of divine will. The stories of these figures not only reflected military skill, but also intertwined their victories with the intervention of the Greek gods, who were perceived as protectors of the city-state, as if the victories about the Persian invader were a manifestation of the divine favor. In this way, mythology and the history of medical wars merge. In the chronicles of Herodoto, for example Plo, the historical story is mixed with fantastic stories, premonitory dreams, the divine visions that foreshadow the defeat of the Persians, and the sacrifices to the gods to ensure victory. In Greek mythology, battles are not only human conflicts, but cosmic events where the fate of nations is in the hands of higher beings. It is in this mixture of history and myth where medical wars acquire a layer of greatness that makes them not only a series of military clashes, but a story about the struggle of man against the divine, of the free will against predestination. But what would have happened if Persia had won? The story, as we know it, would have changed irrevocably. The Western world that arose from the Greek victory and the expansion of Athenian democracy would not have existed. Persia, with its imperial structure, would have established a much more centralized system, in which the Greek polis would have been absorbed under the Persian crown. However, the implications of this victory are not limited only to a political change, but would have reconfigured the beliefs, cultures, and traditions of the entire Mediterranean. If Persia had triumphed, religions and philosophies that defined ancient Greece would have been deeply altered. Athenian democracy, with its emphasis on independent freedom and thought, would have been replaced by a more authoritarian imperial administration. The Greek vision of polis as an autonomous space, where man could influence the collective destiny, would have succumbed under the heavy Persian boot, which favored the imperial unity on local autonomy. The hierarchical structure of Persia, focused on the absolute power of the great monarchs such as Dario and Geras, would have imposed a model of government that would have eradicated many of the freedoms that the Greeks valued. As for the culture, the richness of the Greek tradition, which flourished under the shadow of the war against Persia, would have been in serious danger of disappearing. Greek philosophy, arts, science and poetry, which had their boom after medical wars, could have been suffocated by the imposition of a much more unified Persian culture. The great thinkers of Athens, such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, would probably have not emerged in a world where independent thinking was repressed under the control of a distant monarchy. In fact, if Persia had won, the great achievements of Greek civilization would not have been possible, and the Western world would have followed a completely different path, perhaps without the same obsession with democracy, individual freedom, and human rights that defined the development of modern nations. In addition, without the defeat of the Persians, the expansion of Greek influence through Alexander the Great and Hellenism, which came to influence much of the known world, would never have occurred. On a cultural level, Greek myths would have been different. The Greek gods, who in many stories intervened in the battles and struggles for the independence of the polis, could have been relegated to secondary stories, in favor of a Persian vision of the world more oriented to imperial power and to the Persian gods, such as Ahura Mazda, which represented a more monotheistic and distant conception of the universe. Greek mythology, with their stories of heroes fighting for divine and cosmic forces, could have been supplanted by stories that glorified the absolute authority of the Persian monarchs. Art would also have changed under Persian domain. While Persian influence was already significant, especially in the regions of Asia Minor and Egypt, Greek art, with its realistic sculptures and its emphasis on human proportion, would have lost ground in front of the rich Persian tradition, more oriented to symbolism and imperial grandiosity. The architectures of temples and agoras, which defined Greek aesthetics, would have been replaced by structures more oriented to power and magnificence, such as those seen in the Persian capitals. The story, therefore, shows that Persian victory would not only have altered the geopolitics of the ancient world, but would have had a deep and lasting impact on the cultural, philosophical, and artistic development of humanity. Greece's triumph over Persia, although marked by the sacrifice and courage of the Greek heroes, represents much more than a military victory. It was a victory of the ideals of freedom, democracy, and individualism over imperial authoritarianism, whose consequences were very extended a lot beyond the 5th century BC. The mythology of medical wars, and the questions about what would have happened if Persia had won, they are still part of that rich tapestry of stories that have been woven throughout time. The battle was not only for the control of the territory, but for the control of the values, beliefs, and the future of the known world. If Persia had won the medical wars, the history of the ancient world would have taken a deeply different course. The implications of such victory would not only have affected the Greek polis, but would have transformed the very structure of the Mediterranean civilization, altering the fate of all of Europe, Asia, and beyond. Imagine a world where the Persian Empire, with its vast scope and power, would have consolidated its control over Greek states. Without the heroic resistance of the Greek forces, Persia would have imposed their domain not only military, but also cultural. This imperial power would not only have been exercised through weapons, but also through a centralized administration and a unified government system that would have erased the autonomies of the polis. The Greeks, known for their love for political freedom, would have been absorbed in a Persian system that, although efficient, was remarkably hierarchical, with the divine king at the head of everything. Athenian democracy, with its vibrant political life, its popular assemblies, and its citizen participation system, would have disappeared. Instead, the Persian government model, focused on the absolute monarch and its network of satrapas, provincial governors, would have imposed a much more rigid form of control. The concept of citizenship as the Greeks understood, with their rights, duties, and freedoms, could have been replaced by a more feudal system, with the cities subordinated to Persian power. The consequences of this loss for Greece would have been devastating for the flowering of Western culture. Without the constant threat of Persia, the intellectual revolution that led to the birth of Greek philosophy, with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, perhaps would never have occurred. The great advances in science, arts, mathematics, and politics, which emerged in the 5th century and 4 BC. Under the shadow of war and Athenian democracy, they could have overshadowed by a Persian culture more oriented to imperial stability and centralized control. At the military level, Persian victory would also have deeply altered the strategies and technologies of war. The Persians, with their greatly numerous army and their powerful cavalry, would have left an indelible mark on military development, displacing the Greek tactics based on the phalanx. While the Persians were skilled in the use of archery and centralized command, the Greeks stood out for their tactical ability, their cohesion, and their discipline in close combat. Without the defeat in the Thermopyles or Marathon, there would have been no prolonged war that forced the Greeks to overcome their internal differences and to create new forms of struggle and resistance. In addition, the Greek art and architecture world could have been replaced by the Persian monumental style, characterized by large palaces and temples in honor of the king. Greek architecture, with its temples dedicated to the gods, realistic sculpture, and the emphasis on human proportion, would have been eclipsed by the imperial magnificence of the Persians, whose palaces were vast and decorated with mythological scenes that glorified the power of the monarch. Greek art, which celebrated the human body and harmony, could have been relegated to the background, while Persian aesthetics would have extended throughout the Mediterranean. As for religion, Greece and Persia followed different paths. The Persian religion, focused on Zoroastrism, would have replaced the pantheon of Greek gods that dominated religious life. However, cultural syncretism could have given rise to a mixture of beliefs, giving rise to new religious practices that would combine elements of both traditions. The Greek gods, such as Zeus, Athena, or Apollo, could have been replaced by Persian deities, such as Ahura Mazda, while religious practices that emphasized human freedom and collective participation in rituals could have softened in favor of a more system oriented to the worship of a single supreme god, as in the case of Ahura Mazda. In the long term, the consolidation of Persia about Greece could have given rise to a Hellenistic world under Persian control, which would have made the subsequent expansion of Alexander the Great impossible. Alejandro's kingdom, who brought the Greek culture to the entire Middle East, Egypt, and India, could never have existed. Instead, Persia would have consolidated hegemony over the whole known world, merging Persian administration with some of the Greek cultural advances, but without the same creative spark that arose when the Greeks were forced to face external oppression. Without pressure of the war against Persia, the Greek nations would not have had the same urgency of forming alliances and creating institutions such as the League of Delos, which was key to the expansion and flowering of the Athenian power. Without that external threat, Greece's internal fragmentation could have intensified, and the rivalries between the polis, such as Athens and Sparta, would have ran without a common cause to unite them. In summary, a world in which Persia would have won medical wars would have resulted in a vast empire that, although efficient and powerful, would have been much less culturally dynamic. The absence of medical wars, and the subsequent defeat of Persia, left a vacuum that allowed Greece to flourish in his intellectual, political, and artistic capacity. Instead of imperial consolidation, Greece, through his achievements in philosophy, art, and politics, laid the foundations of what would later be known as the Western world. Thus, Persian victory would have meant a numbness of many of the creative forces that defined modern civilization. The roar of battles, the fierce resistance against the unstoppable Persian power, and the heroic sacrifices of the men and women who rose to defend their home, the medical wars not only molded the fate of Greece, but defined the character of an entire civilization. That struggle, loaded with blood and honor, laid the foundations for what Western culture would later be. And although many only remember military power, the true essence of medical wars resides in what allowed it to be born later, a renewed Greek identity, together with the struggle and determination to protect something much bigger than its cities, freedom itself. In the heat of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamine battles, the Greeks not only fought for the physical survival of their polis, but also because of the preservation of a way of life that exalted democracy, art, philosophy, politics, and knowledge search. The defeat of Persia, with its unstoppable war machine, meant much more than a military victory. It was the triumph of a set of ideals. That conflict revealed the strength of the human spirit when it fights for something that is not only physical, but deeply cultural and spiritual. After the medical wars, Greece found in his resistance a unifying force that transcended the internal divisions between the polis. Athens, Sparta, and all other Greek cities, despite their differences, were linked to a collective identity that, until that moment, had not known. The war showed them that their power not only resided in the greatness of its walls and armies, but in its ability to self-govern, in its nascent democracy, and in the role that each citizen played within that democracy. This rebirth of the Greek unit, forged under the fire of the conflict, would be essential for the future of Western civilization. But beyond the political unit, the legacy of medical wars was deeply reflected in culture. The tragedies, the theatrical works, the philosophies, and the art that flourished in the following century were influenced by a new awareness, an awareness that freedom, self-determination, and personal sacrifice for a greater good were fundamental principles. The rise of Athenian democracy, the creation of the first forms of civil justice, and the first philosophical discussions about ethics and morality arose precisely because the Greeks understood what was at stake. They had seen the shadow of a foreign tyranny that threatened to swallow their world, and as never before, they understood that their civilization could only endure if they remained faithful to their fundamental values. In fact, the conflict was, in many ways, the genesis of what we today recognize as Western culture. The epic poetry of Herodotus, the chronicle of medical wars, not only narrated the facts, but woven a story of heroism, sacrifice, and resistance that fell deep into the collective imaginary. This narrative to fight tyranny became a cornerstone on which the policy, culture, and education of the future would be built. The Greek identity, forged in that fire, not only survived, but also flourished. The victories about Persia fed the pride and confidence of the Greeks, who saw themselves as the bearers of a unique civilization. As the centuries passed, those Greek ideals, justice, beauty, freedom, found a place in the minds and hearts of thinkers, politicians, artists, and scientists, who would take them far beyond the borders of Greece. And so, the Western world, as we know it, was molded by that period of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. On a deeper level, medical wars also left a mark on the spirituality AD and the sense of life. The Greek religion, which saw in the gods the representation of the forces that ruled the universe, began to acquire a more reflective dimension. The Greeks not only became more aware of their place in the world, but also better understood the forces that acted within themselves: courage, loyalty, determination, but also sadness and death. Greek heroism was no longer just a concept of paper, but something that men could achieve through action, through sacrifice on the battlefield, as Leonidas did, and as the thousands who fell in defense of your home. Through this lens, the sacrifice of the heroes of medical wars became an inspiration not only for their contemporaries, but for future generations. The stories of these battles resonate today, not only as war stories, but as eternal lessons about the value, freedom, and commitment to ideals that define a culture. And while the legacy of the medical wars extended beyond the Greek borders, through the Roman Empire, and even arriving at the modern times, the echoes of that conflict were still alive in Western culture. The struggle for freedom, justice, and self-determination that began in the Marathon Plains and Salamina's coasts never disappeared. Every time a nation struggles for its ideals, for their rights, for their identity, the spirit of medical wars is renewed. Today, when we think of medical wars, we not only remember the hardness of battles, but the eternity of their legacy. A legacy that continues to define what it means to be free, own our destiny, and fight for a civilization that values what matters most: human dignity and the right to live in a world that allows us to achieve our maximum potential. The conflict between Greece and Persia during medical wars is a reflection of two deeply different but equally powerful civilizations, whose contrasting dynamics defined not only their relationships, but also the fate of the Mediterranean region. Through Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamine battles, fundamental contrasts between these two cultures are revealed, but contact points and similarities also emerge, which provide a more nuanced vision of their interaction. 1. Political structure. Greek city-states, such as Athens and Sparta, were diverse in their forms of government. Athens, for example, was developing a direct democracy in which citizens actively participated in political decision-making. Instead, Sparta was governed by a military oligarchy, with a strong social hierarchy focused on obedience and discipline. Persia, the Persian Empire, under the Achaemenids, was an absolute monarchy, with the king, the great king, considered divine, a central figure that not only exercised a centralized power, but also supervised a vast system of provinces or satrapia. Each satrapia was governed by a satrap, who had a lot of autonomy but was obliged to account for the Persian king. 2. Concept of freedom. The Greeks deeply valued individual freedom, especially in cities like Athens. Athenian democracy, although limited to free men, represented a form of active participation in government and public life. This freedom was seen as the right to decide on the fate of the polis and to express political opinions. In Persia, freedom was understood differently. Although the people conquered by Persia enjoyed some autonomy under the satrapia system, there was no concept of political freedom like Greek. Obedience to the Persian monarch was fundamental, and any challenge to the king's authority was severely punished. freedom in Persia was more related to tolerance towards local customs within the limits imposed by the central government. 3. Military approach. Greece. The Greek army, particularly in Athens and Sparta, was based on a relatively small but highly disciplined structure. Heavy infantry, the famous phalanges, were the pillar of their strength. The Greek power on the battlefield depended on cohesion, the civic spirit, and the fighting ability of their soldiers, who, for the most part, were citizens committed to the defense of their homeland. Persia. The Persian army was much bigger and diverse. It was often composed of soldiers from different conquered peoples, such as the Egyptians, the Indians, and the Medes. In addition to the infantry, Persia had a formidable cavalry and specialized units such as horsemen. The numerical advantage and the hierarchical organization of the Persians gave them power-awesome military, although the lack of cultural cohesion and dependence on mercenary troops could have been a disadvantage in some clashes. 4. Religion. Greece. The Greeks were polytheistic, venerating a multitude of gods that represented various aspects of human and natural life. Religion was deeply linked to culture and politics, and the gods not only influenced personal life, but also in the collective destinations of city-states. Persia. The Persians practiced Zoroastrismo, a monotheistic religion that focused his cult in Ahura Mazda, the supreme god who represented truth and justice. Persian religion also influenced politics, but in a different sense. The Persian king was considered the representative of Ahura Mazda on earth and, as such, had the divine mandate of governing and expanding the empire. Points in common. 1. Imperial expansion. Both Greece and Persia had expansive ambitions, although their approaches were different. The Persians, under the leadership of Cyril el Grande and Dario I, had created a vast empire that covered from East Asia to Egypt and Anatolia. Persian expansionist policy was directed by the desire to integrate different cultures and peoples under the control of a centralized government. The Greeks, on the other hand, also undertook expansionist expeditions, particularly after the Medical Wars, with Alexander the Great carrying the Hellenic culture to the confines of the Persian Empire and beyond. While the Greeks were not so interested in mastering vast territories as the Persians, their cultural expansion through colonies and trade was significant. 2. Propaganda strategies and diplomacy. Both Greece and Persia used propaganda strategies to reinforce their legitimacy and motivate their citizens. In Persia, the kings presented themselves as the protectors of peace and justice, using art and architecture to glorify their power and divinity. The reliefs in the walls of Persepolis and the edicts of the kings reflected the idea of an orderly and fair kingdom. In Greece, propaganda was equally important, although more focused on the exaltation of freedom and civic heroism. The stories of the victories in Marathon and Salamina were used to instill a sense of national pride and encourage unity against a common threat. Literature, theatre, and works of art played a crucial role in the construction of Greek identity in times of war. 3. Cultural interaction. Despite the differences, Greece and Persia shared mutual cultural influences. The contact between both civilizations was not only warlike, but also intellectual and artistic. Through trade, diplomacy, and capture of territories, Greek and Persian ideas were mixed at different times. For example, in the period after Persia's defeat, cultural syncretism between the Greeks and the Persians was consolidated under Alexander the Great, who adopted many Persian customs and, at the same time, promoted Greek culture throughout its empire. The confrontation between Greece and Persia was not simply a matter of two empires facing the battlefield. It was an ideological, cultural, and political battle. While Persia represented the absolute power of the monarch and centralized control, Greece offered a model of individual democracy and freedom. These contrasts made Medical Wars a conflict loaded with meanings beyond the military. However, history also shows that, despite the differences, both civilizations shared similar aspirations: the desire to prosper, expand, and leave a lasting legacy in the history of the ancient world. The role of Aegean Sea, strategic and cultural importance. The Aegean Sea played a crucial role in both the military strategy and in culture during Medical Wars, as well as in the general development of Greek and Persian civilizations. Its geographical location, between Europe and Asia, made it a point of contact and conflict between these two great cultures, while its relevance for navigation and trade was also vital in the construction of the economies of Greek city-states and the Persian Empire. 1. Communication and commerce. the Aegean Sea was an essential route of communication for Greek cities, especially Athens, which depended on it to access other regions of the Mediterranean world. Through its waters, the Greeks were able to trade with other civilizations and share ideas. In addition, maritime trade facilitated the exchange of resources, technology, and culture. For Persia, the control of maritime routes in the Aegean was crucial to ensure their dominance over Asia Minor and nearby territories. This included access to the Greek islands, that were strategic points in the sea and could provide resources or serve as military bases. 2. Decisive battle center. Medical wars demonstrated the military importance of Aegean Sea. In the Battle of Salamina, for 80 BC, for example, the strait between Salamina Island and the Attica coast was the scene of a decisive victory for the Greek fleet. Despite being in numerical inferiority, the Greeks, led by Themistocles, used their knowledge of the land and the upper naval tactics to defeat the Persian fleet, which had advanced towards Greece with the intention of annihilating the Greek city-states. In addition, the sea offered a strategic advantage to Greek city-states, which could defend themselves through rapid and surprising naval incursions, hindering attempts to invasion by the Persians. The Greek fleets, which were mostly composed of triremes, light and fast war ships, were a constant threat to Persian fleets, which, although they were larger, lacked the necessary maneuverability to face the Greek tactics. 3. Reduction of Persian threat. Sea control was a key to Greek resistance. After the victory in Salamina, the Greek cities, especially Athens, established a naval supremacy in the Aegean. This allowed the Greek forces to intercept communications and Persian supplies, gradually weakening the ability of the Persian Empire to continue their invasion. The Aegean Sea was also a crucial point for guerrillas and evasion tactics, allowing Greeks to withdraw and regroup more easily, avoiding direct confrontation with Persian terrestrial forces, larger but less mobile. 1. Links between islands and polis. The Aegean Sea also had a central role in the creation of a common Greek cultural identity, despite the political fragmentation of the polis. The Aegean islands, such as Delos, Naxos, and Samothracia, played a key role in the dissemination of Greek culture. Many of these islands were centers of religious worship, art, and philosophy, which helped consolidate a sense of cultural unity between the various polis, despite their political and social differences. The Greek cities, especially Athens, established colonies and commercial networks throughout the Aegean and southern Italy. 2. Refuge and evacuation. During the Persian invasion, the Aegean Sea also became a means of escape and refuge. The city of Athens, for example, was evacuated, and its inhabitants moved to the nearby islands to escape from Persian looting. The evacuation of Athens and the subsequent victory in Salamina symbolized the ability of Greek civilization to resist and adapt to adversities, using their maritime resources to stay safe and reorganized. 3. Naval culture and Greek identity. The domain of the Aegean Sea also promoted a naval culture in Greek city-states, especially in Athens, which reached its peak during the hegemony of the Delos League. The construction of powerful fleets and the practice of the naval war became key elements of the Greek identity, and the Aegean Sea became a symbol of independence and strength for the Greek polis. In addition, the sailor was one of the areas where democracy was encouraged. In Athens, the sailors of the triremes were free citizens who, although they did not belong to the upper classes, played a crucial role in the defense of the city, which gave them voice in politics and government, reinforcing the idea of democratic participation. The Aegean Sea was much more than a simple body of water. It was a determining factor in the defense and survival of Greek states during medical wars. Its strategic importance, both for trade and war, made it the axis of Greek resistance against the Persian Empire. In addition, its cultural influence contributed to the development of a common Greek identity that lasts far beyond medical wars, extending its influence to other parts of the Mediterranean world and creating a legacy that endured in the history of Western civilization. The medical wars, one of the most fundamental episodes in the history of ancient Greece, were not only marked by epic battles and legendary heroes, but also by how the events were narrated and preserved throughout the centuries. In that sense, historical sources play a crucial role to understand how those moments were lived, how they were interpreted and, above all, how they transmitted to this day. Among the most outstanding sources are Herodotus, known as the father of history, whose chronicles about medical wars offer a fascinating story, but also full of nuances that invite you to question the veracity of certain events. Herodotus was born in Halikarnasso, in what is today Turkey, and his work, Stories, is the first systematic attempt to document the past and the causes of the great conflicts between the peoples. He was a cunning observer, but he was also influenced by oral stories and traditions of his time. Although some of their stories may seem more mythological than historical, their work remains a fundamental pillar to no medical wars. Herodotus, witness and narrator of medical wars. Herodotus is known for his unique narrative style. Not only is it limited to telling what happened, but trying to explain the reasons behind the events, explore the motivations of the leaders, and examine the divine interventions or influences of the gods in politics of the Greek and Persian polis. This form of story gives an almost mystical character to historical events, which makes the work rich, but also sometimes difficult to differentiate from legends. However, his testimony is invaluable, since he was one of the first to systematize a narrative that not only focused on the facts, but also on the causes, effects, and interactions between cultures. The chronicles of Herodotus on medical wars, especially on the battles of Marathon, Salamina, and Plataea, present to the Persians as a powerful and well-organized empire, but also exposes the virtues and the Greek resistance. The description of the Battle of the Thermopylae, with the courage of Leonidas and its 300 Spartans, has been recorded in collective memory as a symbol of sacrifice and heroism. Although it is possible that Herodotus has embellished certain details to make the story more epic, his work remains the main source about the events of those wars. Other historical sources, although Herodotus is the best-known chronicler of medical wars, he is not the only one who offers his version of the facts. In particular, Thucydides, a later historian, wrote about the history of Greece and wars that followed the Doctors, the Peloponnese Wars. Although Thucydides did not focus exclusively on medical wars, its most critical and analytical approach on Greek political and social events provides a valuable perspective. Thucydides, unlike Herodotus, had a more cynical vision of human nature, and its stories are less prone to mythification and more focused on the causes and direct effects of conflicts. Another relevant testimony comes from the inscriptions and monuments that were erected to commemorate the Greek victories in medical wars, such as the famous frieze of Thermopylae, which shows heroic scenes of the battle and serves as a visual testimony of the official narrative that it wanted to transmit at that time. These monuments were used as well as civic pride symbols and reminders of the sacrifices made during the war. The Greek and Persian interpretation of the conflict. From the Greek perspective, the history of medical wars is not only about the defense against a foreign invader, but about the struggle to maintain its identity and autonomy. For the Greeks, especially for Athens, the conflict with Persia represented the defense of freedom against tyranny. This recurring theme is evident in the Greek stories, where the heroes fight not only for survival, but for the democratic values that define the Greek polis. On the other hand, the Persian perspective is presented more diffuse due to the lack of written historical stories that will reach us in the same detail as the Greeks. However, in Persian inscriptions, such as Dario I and Xerxes I, there is a narrative of conquest and control of vast territories, in which defeats are not always mentioned, and Persian leaders are presented as power figures almost divine. In these chronicles, wars are seen as part of a process of legitimate expansion of an empire that saw Greek cities as rebel states that had to submit to the Persian imperial order. An beautified story? The question of the reliability of ancient historical sources is a constant concern when it comes to medical wars. The chronicles of Herodotus, in particular, have been criticized for being more literary narratives than stories strictly faithful to the facts. His stories, especially those who describe the divine intervention, the appearance of supernatural heroes, and the epic exploits of the Greek leaders, suggest that the border between myth and history was not always clear for him. However, many of the elements that Herodotus writes, such as war tactics, military formations, and Persian organization, coincide with what we know from other sources and archaeology, which makes his work, although not infallible, is a cornerstone for historical studies. In addition, oral stories also played an important role in the transmission of these stories. The heroic feats of characters such as Leonidas or Themistocles were sung in the squares of the cities, were represented in the tragedies, and were recorded in the chronicles. It is possible that the repetition of these stories, throughout generations, has contributed to beautify the facts and give them an epic dimension, where the truth and legend were intertwined. Historical sources on medical wars, particularly the chronicles of Herodotus, have been fundamental to rebuild one of the most crucial episodes in ancient history. Although we must be aware of the limits of these sources and the possible distortions in the stories, their value is incalculable. The narratives of Herodotus, Thucydides, and other authors not only provide us with a vision of the facts, but also offer us a window to the mentalities, beliefs, and aspirations of the civilizations that faced each other in these dramatic conflicts. Medical wars offer valuable lessons for modernity, especially with regard to leadership, unity, and resistance against invasions or external threats. Although the circumstances of ancient Greece and Persia were very different from those of today, the fundamental principles that guided the Greeks in their fight against the Persian Empire remain relevant. Leadership. One of the most notable aspects of medical wars was the outstanding leadership of figures such as Leonidas de Sparta, Themes of Athens, and Miltiades. These leaders were not only skilled on the battlefield, but also knew how to make crucial strategic decisions, such as the concentration of forces at strategic points such as Thermopylae or the Salamine Narrow. In times of crisis, a clear, decisive leadership capable of inspiring unity in the town is essential. Leaders must be able to adapt their tactics to circumstances and make difficult decisions, such as Themistocles, who used their cunning to overcome the Persian fleet in a narrow where Greek forces benefited from their knowledge of the land. The unity between the Greek polis, despite their differences, was fundamental for their victory. During medical wars, Greek city-states linked forces, leaving aside their rivalries, for a common cause: survival against Persian threat. This type of union is a reminder that, given a common enemy, cooperation and solidarity can overcome internal historical and political differences. In a modern world, cooperation between countries or groups with shared interests is key to face global challenges, either in the fight against pandemics, climate change, or military threats. Resistance to invasions. Resistance in medical wars, both on the battlefield and in the cultural and moral sphere, shows how a nation or a town can face larger and more powerful invasions, not only with military force, but also with determination and spirit of struggle. Marathon's battle, in particular, is an example of how numerically lower forces can defeat an invading army through effective tactics and courage. In modern times, this can be applied not only to military threats, but also to political, economic, or social challenges, where smaller or less powerful nations can resist and even prevail through perseverance and strategic intelligence. The lessons of medical wars on leadership, unity, and resistance remain useful today. They teach us that, even when probabilities seem to be against, cooperation between allies, inspired leadership, and unwavering determination can make a difference in the fight against invaders or external threats. In an increasingly globalized world, these lessons remain applicable to address both the conflicts and the challenges we face today. The conflict between Greece and Persia, although it developed more than 2,500 years ago, remains relevant today. The dynamics of power, the clashes of civilizations, and the strategies used during medical wars have surprising parallels with many of the contemporary conflicts we face in the modern world. The clash of civilizations. One of the clearest parallels between medical wars and current conflicts is the idea of a clash of civilizations. In the case of medical wars, the Greeks fought not only for their survival, but also for the preservation of a culture and way of life that looked very different from that of the Persians. Persia represented a vast, centralized empire, with a bureaucratic administration and a monarchical vision of power, while Greece, with its independent polis and its emphasis on democracy and freedom, was a radically different culture. In the contemporary world, we often see similar tensions between countries or civilizations that defend their way of life against external powers that seek to impose their own systems. The confrontation between the democratic West and some authoritarian or centralized systems is a recurring theme, from the Cold War to current conflicts in the Middle East or in Asia. As in medical wars, the fight is not only political or territorial, but also cultural. Strategies. Power inequalities. Another important parallel is the strategy used by the Greeks when facing a much larger and more powerful Persian Empire. Despite being numerically lower, the Greeks used intelligent tactics, such as the choice of the land in the Marathon battle or the narrowing in the Salamina Strait, to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage. This type of strategies remains relevant today, where the smallest or less powerful countries resort to asymmetric tactics, such as guerrillas or cyber attacks, to counteract larger powers. In modern war, advanced technologies, such as drones and cyber attacks, allow smaller or less resources to challenge technologically superior empires. Like the Greeks, the smallest actors have adapted to the circumstances and, sometimes, have achieved surprising victories. External opposition resistance. The resistance to an external invasion by a specific population to maintain their independence also remains a constant in modern conflicts. Either in Ukraine resisting Russian invasion or in the struggles for the independence of occupied territories or nations, the history of medical wars reflects the human desire for preservation against oppression. Like the Greeks, current nations fight not only for their territory, but for their cultural identity, their form of government, and their freedom. The effects of unification. A relevant aspect is how Persian invasion joined the various Greek polis, despite their internal differences. The common enemy forged alliances and set aside internal quarrels, which allowed the Greeks to coordinate more effectively. This type of unity, motivated by an external threat, remains relevant in current international policy. Many countries only manage to put aside their differences when they face a common danger, as we see with alliances in times of war, such as NATO, or in cooperation against global threats such as climate change or COVID-19 pandemic. Although the historical context of medical wars is very different from that of contemporary conflicts, lessons on resistance, asymmetric strategies, and the importance of unity against a common threat are still fundamental. The clash between Greece and Persia remains a reflection of how nations face external challenges and how sometimes cunning, determination, and cooperation can change the course of history. The clash between the East and West, manifested in the medical wars, has endured over the centuries, transforming and adapting to the circumstances of each era. In its nucleus, this confrontation was not only a matter of territory or power, but also of values, philosophies, and visions of the world. The Persians represented a civilization with a centralized power, a monarchical structure, and a sophisticated administration, while the Greeks, although fragmented, offered a model of city-states with an emphasis on democracy, individual freedom, and philosophy. This contrast, which at the time was reflected in the Marathon battle or in the Thermopyles, extends beyond antiquity to contemporary tensions between political systems and cultures from different parts of the world. Today, the eternal debate about the East and West remains relevant. Throughout history, tensions between these two civilization blocks have evolved, but underlying conflicts remain the same: the fear of the unknown, the desire to impose a way of life on another, and the struggle for control, whether political, economic, or cultural. The West, often identified with liberalism, democracy, and human rights, faces government systems in the East that are seen as more authoritarian, centralized, and less focused on individual rights. However, the debate is not as simple as an enfrontation between good and bad, freedom and oppression. The cultures of the East and West are not monolithic. Within each there are multiplicity of approaches, ideologies, and systems that overlap, interrelate, and often influence each other. Modern technology, global trade, migrations, and cultural exchanges have blurred the borders between the East and West, and the lessons of medical wars remind us that these borders are not fixed or eternal. This clash is not limited to the old battles between empires. It is expressed in the global economy, international relations, ideological conflicts, and struggles for power. The current polarization between these two blocks of civilization reflects a deeper division than simply a competition for the control of the territory. It is a confrontation between very different ways of understanding life, politics, religion, economy, and identity. In the background, what medical wars teach us is that when two cultures face, the fight is not only for the territory or for military victory, but also for the preservation of what each one considers its essence. Greece struggled for the autonomy of his polis, for the freedom of his democracy, while Persia sought to consolidate his empire, expand his influence, and subject others under his centralized system. Today, although the circumstances are very different, that same spirit of defense of what is considered sacred is still alive in the political and cultural struggles of the modern world. As it happened centuries ago, each civilization faces the challenge of defining its identity in a context of globalization and, in many cases, confrontation. Ultimately, the eternal debate between the East and the West is not just a matter of opposite civilizations. It is a continuous reflection on humanity itself, how we understand each other, how we respect ourselves, and how, despite our differences, we can learn from each other to build a shared future. As the Greeks and Persians demonstrated it thousands of years ago, conflicts are not inevitable. The lessons of the story can, if they are given the necessary value, help us build bridges instead of walls.